Hey guys, welcome to Sleep into Power. I am NJ. Wherever you happen to be right now, whatever hour the clock is showing in your part of the world, I'm very glad you found your way here tonight. Some of you are listening in the deep quiet of the early hours, with the house asleep around you. Some of you are lying in the dark at the end of a long shift, letting the day finally loosen its grip. Some of you are on the other side of the planet entirely, halfway through an afternoon, headphones on, stealing a little pocket of calm from a busy day. It doesn't matter which. You're welcome here, and there's nowhere you need to be for the next few hours, except exactly where you are. Before we begin, I want to say thank you. This channel has grown into something I never quite expected, and that's entirely because of the people who show up night after night, who leave a kind word in the comments, who tell me which stories they'd like to hear next. Tonight's journey came from one of you, a suggestion, quietly left, asking whether we might one day travel into the jungles of Central America and follow the story of the Maya. So here we are, and to the subscriber who asked for this one, you know who you are. Thank you. If you'd like to carry a little of this with you into the daylight hours, the Sleep into Power book is available on Amazon in paperback and on Kindle. It's a slower, quieter sort of book, written in the same spirit as these journeys. Every documentary on this channel is also available on Spotify and on Apple Podcasts. So if you'd rather listen with your screen off and your phone face down, you can. And if you're looking for something shorter and softer, guided meditations and long ambient soundscapes are waiting for you over on the Meditate into Power channel. Should you ever feel moved to support what we do here, there's a Buy Me a Coffee link in the description. It's never expected, it's always appreciated, and it genuinely keeps these long nights of writing and recording possible. Now, tonight we are going somewhere green. Imagine, for a moment, a forest that goes on beyond the reach of sight. Not the tidy woodland of temperate countries, with its bare winter branches and its careful seasons, but a wall of living heat. Trees 150 feet tall, their roots buttressed like the flying arches of a cathedral. Vines thick as a man's arm hanging in loops from the canopy. Air so heavy with moisture that it settles on your skin the moment you step beneath the leaves. Somewhere above, invisible, a troop of howler monkeys begins its low, rolling call, a sound like distant thunder that carries for 3 miles through the trees. And beneath all of that, buried under 1,000 years of fallen leaves and patient root and slow, soft rain, a city, not a village, not a ruin in the small sense of the word, a city with plazas, paved in white limestone plaster, so bright at midday that visitors had to shade their eyes. Pyramids rising 200 feet through the canopy, their upper temples painted blood red and set with towering roof cones of carved stone. Reservoirs engineered to hold millions of liters of rainwater. Causeways running arrows straight through the swamp. Ball courts, palaces, markets, observatories. Tens of thousands of people living, arguing, cooking, trading, praying, raising children, burying their dead. And beyond that city, another. And beyond that, another still. Dozens of them, hundreds. A landscape so thickly settled that modern archaeologists, mapping it from the air with lasers, have found themselves genuinely startled by how little empty space there was. This is the world of the Maya, and it is one of the most misunderstood civilizations that has ever existed. You may have heard some of the stories, that the Maya vanished, that they disappeared overnight, leaving their cities to the jungle for reasons nobody can explain, that their calendar predicted the end of the world. Almost all of it is wrong, or at best, badly distorted. The truth is stranger, richer, and far more human than the myth, and by the time this night is over, you'll understand why. Because the Maya did not vanish. There are more than 6 million Maya people alive today, speaking around 30 distinct Mayan languages, farming the same hills their ancestors farmed, in Guatemala and Mexico, in Belize, Honduras and El Salvador. Their story did not end. It changed, violently and tragically at times, but it continued, and it continues now, tonight, while you're listening. What did happen is far more interesting than a disappearance. Over the course of roughly 3,000 years, a scattering of farming villages in the lowland forests grew into one of only a handful of civilizations in human history to independently invent a complete writing system. They developed a mathematics that included the concept of zero, centuries before that idea reached medieval Europe. They tracked the movements of Venus so precisely that their tables drift by only a couple of hours across 5 centuries. They built cities without metal tools, without the wheel used for transport, without draft animals of any kind. Every single stone was cut with stone and carried on a human back. And then, across the 9th century, in a process that took not one night but roughly 150 years, the great southern cities emptied. The kings stopped commissioning monuments. The plazas fell silent. The forest, which had always been waiting, moved back in. Why is one of the genuinely open questions of archaeology, and we'll spend a good part of tonight sitting with it, turning it over, examining the evidence as it actually stands, rather than as the documentaries usually tell it. But we won't start there. We'll start long before the pyramids, before the kings, before writing. We'll start with a landscape, and with the slow arrival of people into it, and with a wild grass that would change everything. Along the way, we'll walk through the markets of Tikal, and stand in the tomb chamber of a king at Palenque who was buried beneath a lid of carved limestone, so extraordinary that people have been arguing about it for 70 years. We'll follow the hieroglyphs from complete illegibility to the astonishing moment, within living memory, when they finally began to speak. We'll go down into the caves, where the Maya believed the earth breathed. We'll sit in a jungle court while a rubber ball, heavy as a bowling ball and hard as wood, thuds against a stone wall, in a game that was never really only a game. And gradually, as the hours pass and the night deepens, the story will slow. That's by design. There's no cliffhanger waiting for you at the end of this. Nothing is going to jolt you awake. If you fall asleep somewhere in the 2nd century, or halfway up a pyramid, or in the middle of a market square in the year 700, that's exactly as it should be. The story will still be here. So find the position you'll actually be sleeping in, rather than the one you're in now. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Let the jaw unclench. Breathe out a little longer than you breathe in, once or twice, and then stop thinking about the breathing altogether. The lamp is low. The world outside has gone quiet. Now, let the day go. Let the forest close over you, and let us walk back together into the green. To understand the Maya, you first have to understand the ground beneath their feet, because almost everything about their civilization grew out of a very particular and rather difficult piece of the earth. Look at a map of the Americas and find the place where the continent narrows and bends, where North America tapers down towards the isthmus and Central America begins its long curve towards the south. There, jutting out into the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean, like a great blunt thumb, is the Yucatan Peninsula. South and west of it, the land rises into volcanic highlands. Between the two, a vast lowland basin of forest and swamp and limestone. This whole region, taken together, is the Maya world, roughly 1/3 of a million square kilometers, spread across what are now 5 modern nations. It is not one landscape, it is at least 3, and the differences between them shaped everything that followed. Begin in the south, in the highlands of what is now Guatemala and Chiapas. Here the land climbs into a chain of volcanoes, some of them still restless, their cones wrapped in cloud for weeks at a time. The air at these altitudes is cool and thin and clean. Pine forests give way to oak. Mountain lakes sit in ancient craters, their water so deep and still that the surrounding volcanoes lie perfectly reflected in them at dawn. The soil, enriched by centuries of volcanic ash, is some of the most fertile in Mesoamerica. And scattered through these mountains are two substances that would make the highlands wealthy: jade, in the valley of the Motagua River, the only significant source in all of Mesoamerica, and obsidian, the black volcanic glass that fractures into blades, sharper than surgical steel. Descend northwards and the land drops away, and the air thickens and the temperature climbs. You enter the lowlands. This is the Petén, a great limestone shelf blanketed in tropical forest, and it is the heartland of everything we're going to talk about tonight. Mahogany and ceiba and sapodilla tower overhead. Beneath them, the light turns green and dim, filtered through layer upon layer of leaf. Rain falls here in extraordinary quantities, well over 2 meters a year in places, but only for half the year. From roughly May to December, the sky opens almost daily. Warm, heavy rain drumming on the canopy, turning trails to red mud. Then, from January onwards, it simply stops. The dry season arrives and holds, month after month, until the streams shrink and the waterholes turn to cracked clay, and the forest itself begins to shed leaves in self-defense. Continue north and the forest thins, the trees shorten, and you reach the Yucatan proper, flat, scrubby, hot, and almost completely without surface water. No rivers, no lakes to speak of. Rain that falls here vanishes almost immediately, because the whole peninsula is a slab of porous limestone, and water sinks through limestone the way it sinks through a sponge. That single geological fact deserves a moment, because it explains a great deal about Maya religion, Maya engineering, and Maya settlement patterns all at once. Beneath the northern Yucatan runs an enormous network of flooded caves and underground rivers, one of the largest such systems on Earth. Where the roof of one of these caverns has collapsed, a circular shaft opens in the ground, revealing the water table below. The Maya called such a place a zonot. We know the word, slightly altered by Spanish, as cenote. Some are shallow and green and choked with vines. Some are perfect wells of blue, 40 meters across, with sheer white walls and swallows nesting in the cracks and shafts of sunlight, falling through the opening onto water so clear that fish appear to hang in mid-air. If you stand at the lip of one of these and look down, you are looking at the only reliable drinking water for miles. Imagine what that does to a people's imagination. Water, the one thing you cannot live without, does not run past your village in a friendly stream. It waits below, in the dark, in the earth. To reach it, you must descend. And so the underworld, in Maya thought, was never simply a place of the dead. It was the source of life. Caves and cenotes were doorways, and rain itself was understood as something the gods released from within the mountains, rather than something the sky merely produced. Every great Maya city grew up around a solution to the water problem. In the north, around cenotes. In the central lowlands, around vast artificial reservoirs, plastered watertight and fed by carefully graded plazas that acted as catchment surfaces, so that an entire city center became, in effect, one enormous funnel channeling the wet season rains into storage that had to last until May. They were living, in other words, in a place of tremendous abundance that could turn on them without warning. Hold that thought. It will matter a great deal, many centuries from now, when the rains begin to fail. Now, into this landscape, people. The first human beings to enter the Americas came out of Northeast Asia, crossing the exposed land of Beringia during the last glacial period, and moving south along the coast and through the interior. Exactly when remains a live and rather energetic debate among specialists. The older textbook answer, around 13,000 years ago, has been steadily pushed back by newer finds, and a number of sites now suggest a human presence considerably earlier. What is not in dispute is that by roughly 11 or 12,000 years ago, people were living throughout Mesoamerica. We know them mostly from their stone, fluted spear points, beautifully worked, scattered across the highlands. In the flooded caves of the Yucatan, divers have found something rarer still: the skeletons of people who walked into those caverns when they were dry, before the ice sheets melted and the sea rose and the water came in. One young woman, recovered from a cave near Tulum and known to researchers as Naya, fell into a deep chamber some 12 or 13,000 years ago and lay undisturbed in the dark until the beam of a diver's torch found her. These earliest peoples hunted, gathered, and moved. They followed deer through the highland pine forests, netted fish in coastal lagoons, gathered fruit and nuts and roots, and the eggs of turtles. For thousands of years, life carried on in this rhythm, and nothing that we would recognize as a civilization existed anywhere in the region. The change, when it came out of a grass. In the valleys of southern Mexico grows a scruffy, unpromising wild plant called teosinte. It stands about waist high and produces a small spike bearing perhaps a dozen hard kernels, each sealed in a shell so tough you could break a tooth on it. Nobody looking at teosinte would guess what it was capable of becoming. Somewhere around 9,000 years ago, in the Balsas River Valley, people began to select it. They kept the seeds from plants with slightly larger kernels, slightly softer casings, slightly more generous heads. They planted those. They selected again, and again, and again, across generations that stretched into millennia, in what is surely one of the most extraordinary acts of patient collective engineering in the human record. Slowly, imperceptibly within any single lifetime, the scruffy grass became maize. Ancient DNA and archaeobotany have shown just how gradual this was. Early maize cobs were tiny, barely the length of a thumb. It took thousands of years for the plant to become productive enough to serve as a staple rather than a supplement. But once it did, everything else followed. Maize is a remarkable food. It grows fast, it stores well when dried, and it will thrive in hot conditions that defeat other grains. It has one significant weakness. Eaten alone, it lacks certain essential amino acids and locks up its niacin in a form the human body cannot absorb. Mesoamerican peoples solved both problems without any knowledge of biochemistry whatsoever. They soaked the dried kernels in water treated with wood ash or powdered lime, a process now called nixtamalization, which softens the hull, releases the niacin, and improves the protein. And they planted maize alongside beans and squash in the same field, the beans fixing nitrogen in the soil and supplying the missing amino acids, the squash spreading its broad leaves across the ground to suppress weeds and hold moisture, the maize stalk giving the bean vine something to climb. Three plants grown together that between them make a complete diet and a self-sustaining field. Later generations would call this arrangement the milpa. It fed Mesoamerica for 4,000 years, and in villages across Guatemala and southern Mexico, it is feeding people tonight. With reliable food came permanence. You cannot store a granary if you're moving every few weeks. Around 2,000 years before the Common Era, and in places somewhat earlier, small permanent settlements begin to appear across the Maya region. At Cuello in northern Belize, at Ceibal on the Pasión River, at sites along the Pacific coast of Chiapas, archaeologists find the same signature: post holes from pole and thatch houses, hearths, burials beneath the floors, and pottery. Pottery matters more than it might sound. It is heavy, it is fragile, and it is useless to a people constantly on the move. Its arrival is a declaration of intent. It says, "We are staying." Picture one of these first villages. Perhaps a dozen houses arranged around an open space of beaten earth, each one oval or rectangular, walls of upright poles daubed with mud, a steep thatched roof of palm to shed the rains. Inside, A raised sleeping bench along one wall, a hearth of 3 stones on the floor, gourds hanging from the rafters, the smell of wood smoke soaked permanently into everything. Outside, the milpa, a clearing hacked and burned out of the forest, blackened stumps still standing among the young maize, the whole plot only usable for a few years before the soil tires and a new patch must be cut. Children run between the houses. Someone is grinding maize on a stone, the same repetitive scraping sound that would be heard every dawn across Mesoamerica for the next 4,000 years. A dog, small and hairless, and destined eventually for the cooking pot, lies in a patch of shade. Turkeys pick at the ground. Beyond the clearing, the forest presses close, full of things that are useful and things that are dangerous and things that are both. Deer and peccary to hunt, ramon nuts to gather, jaguars, which take dogs and occasionally children, fer-de-lance vipers in the leaf litter, patterned so perfectly that you will not see one until you have already stepped. Life in these villages was not simple, but it was small. Everyone knew everyone. Decisions were made by consensus, or by whoever's opinion carried most weight around the fire. There were no kings, no priests in the formal sense, no monuments, no writing. And yet, even here, the seeds of everything to come were already germinating. In the burials, some individuals are laid to rest with jade beads and marine shell, goods carried from hundreds of kilometers away. Not everyone receives them. Somebody in that village of a dozen houses was already, in some quiet way, more important than everybody else. That small inequality, repeated and amplified across 1,000 years, is where the pyramids come from. Roughly 3,500 years ago, on the humid Gulf Coast west of the Maya region, something new appeared. The people we call the Olmec left no name for themselves that we can read. What they left instead were colossal heads, portrait boulders of basalt, some of them 3 meters tall and weighing more than 20 tons, carved into the faces of individual men wearing close-fitting helmets. Each face is different. Each has the heavy-lidded, slightly downturned expression of someone who does not need to raise his voice. The stone was quarried in the Tuxtla Mountains and moved, without wheels or draft animals, 60 kilometers or more, to the ceremonial centers at San Lorenzo and La Venta. Whoever these men were, they were the first individuals in Mesoamerican history to be depicted as individuals. That, in itself, is a revolution. For a long time, the Olmec were described as the mother culture of Mesoamerica, the single source from which everything else descended, the Maya included. That framing has softened considerably. Most specialists now prefer to speak of a sister relationship, a period in which several regions were in intense contact, exchanging goods and ideas and iconography, with the Gulf Coast as one especially influential participant, rather than a sole parent. Rather than a straight line of inheritance, imagine a conversation, but the conversation left marks that are impossible to miss. The were-jaguar imagery, half human and half cat. The sacred mountain rendered as an artificial pyramid. The obsession with jade, worked with astonishing skill, using only string, sand and water. The ball game, whose rubber the Olmec were processing by mixing latex with the juice of a morning glory vine to make it bounce. All of these appear on the Gulf Coast early, and all of them reappear in Maya hands. And then, in 2020, a discovery in the Mexican state of Tabasco complicated the story in a way nobody had anticipated. A team led by the archaeologist Takeshi Inomata was flying laser survey equipment over a stretch of cattle pasture near the Guatemalan border. LiDAR works by pulsing hundreds of thousands of laser beams at the ground from an aircraft and measuring the time each takes to return. Most of the pulses hit leaves. A few slip through the gaps in the canopy, strike the actual soil, and bounce back. Filter out everything that hit vegetation, and what remains is a naked map of the Earth's surface with the forest stripped away. What appeared on their screens was a rectangle, an enormous one, a raised artificial platform some 1,400 meters long and 400 meters wide, 10 to 15 meters high, so vast and so low that people had been driving tractors across it for decades without realizing they were on top of anything at all. They named it Aguada Phoenix, and radiocarbon dating placed its construction between about 1100 and 800 years before the Common Era. It is, by volume, the largest monumental construction ever found in the Maya area, and it was built centuries before there were any Maya kings. That last point is what makes it genuinely startling. The old model held that monumental architecture requires a ruler, that somebody must command the labor before the labor can be organized. Aguada Phoenix has no palaces, no royal tombs, no sculptures of individual rulers, no evidence of a stratified elite living apart from everyone else. It appears to have been a gathering place, an immense open plaza raised above the floodplain, built by communities acting in concert, for ceremonies that involved everyone. Inamata's team went on to identify nearly 500 similar complexes across the region, sharing a common plan and orientation. Many are aligned to sunrise on particular dates, which suggests that calendrical observation was already structuring people's lives long before anyone wrote a date down. So the sequence was not, as once assumed, kings first and monuments after. Sometimes it was the other way round. The monuments came first, and the hierarchy grew up inside them. By around 400 years before the Common Era, though, hierarchy was arriving in earnest, and the center of gravity had shifted east into the lowland forests of the Petén. There, in the Mirador Basin, in a bowl of low seasonal swamp surrounded by higher ground, a city rose that would not be equaled in scale for another 1,000 years. El Mirador is difficult to reach even now. There is no road. You walk, for 2 days, through forest, or you take a helicopter. When you finally arrive at the base of the structure known as La Danta, what you see is a hill. Only when you begin to climb, and notice the geometry of it, the terraces, the sudden right angles under the leaf litter, do you understand that the hill is the building. La Danta sits on a natural rise, but the platform beneath it, and the 3 tiers above it, are entirely artificial. From base to summit, the complex stands around 70 meters, and its total volume is greater than that of the Great Pyramid of Giza. It was built in stages between roughly 300 years before the Common Era and the 1st century after, and it was raised without metal tools, without wheeled transport, without a single beast of burden. Every block of limestone was quarried with stone and shell, dressed by hand, and carried on a human back, held by a tumpline strap across the forehead. Around La Danta spread a city of perhaps 100,000 people at its height, joined to satellite settlements by causeways, which the Maya called Sakbiob, white roads, built up above the swamp, plastered brilliant white, running dead straight for kilometers through the forest. Beneath the plaster lay layers of fill and rubble, engineered to drain. Some of these causeways were 40 meters wide. There were no vehicles to require such width. They were wide because they were meant to impress. And in the plaster of El Mirador, there is something else, something that survives in only a handful of places: painted friezes. In one, uncovered in a water channel, 2 figures swim through a stylized watery underworld, carrying between them what appears to be a severed head. The scene corresponds to episodes in the Popol Vuh, the great Maya creation epic, which would not be written down in the alphabet for another 1,800 years, meaning that the stories the Maya were still telling in the 16th century were already being painted on walls in the 2nd century before the Common Era. Very little in world archaeology offers that kind of continuity. El Mirador's rise came alongside a shift in how power was displayed. On the great platforms at Wak Saktun and Seros and Nakbe, the Maya began to build stepped pyramids flanked by enormous stucco masks, faces 4 meters high, modeled in lime plaster and painted red, representing the sun, the earth, the serpent, mountains that were also gods. To climb such a stair, passing between 2 colossal divine faces, was to be told without a single word that you were entering a different order of reality. Somewhere in this period, the crucial idea arrived. Not simply that some people should lead, but that certain individuals stood in a personal relationship with the gods, and that this relationship was inheritable. We can watch it happen in the artwork. Early figures are generic. Then, gradually, they become specific, named, dated, portrayed with individual features and personal regalia. By the 1st century of the Common Era, at sites like Tikal and San Bartolo, we have images of rulers accompanied by hieroglyphs that record who they were. The San Bartolo murals, discovered in 2001 by an archaeologist sheltering from the sun in a looter's trench, are the finest surviving example. Painted around 100 years before the Common Era, they wrap around the interior of a small buried chamber in colors that still hold their intensity, reds and yellows and a soft luminous blue. They show the maize god being born, dancing, dying and rising again. They show the 4 world trees at the corners of creation, and in one panel, a young lord is crowned, receiving his headdress while a figure holds it out to him. Nearby, painted on a wall fragment from the same site, are 10 hieroglyphic signs. They are among the earliest known Maya writing, and nobody can read them. The system was already in place. We have simply lost the key to its earliest form. The title these new rulers took was Ajau, Lord, and later, the greatest of them would style themselves Kuhul Ajau, Holy Lord, Divine Lord. The word carried a claim. The Kuhul Ajau was not merely the head of a lineage. He was the axis around which the world turned, the human being through whom the maize grew, and the rains came, and the ancestors could be reached. When he let his own blood in ritual, he did so not as a gesture, but as a payment, the debt owed to the gods who had made humanity out of maize dough and who required nourishment in return. This is an idea with enormous consequences. It means the king's body is the guarantee of the harvest. It means his success in war demonstrates divine favor, and his failure raises awkward questions. It means that when the rain does not come, someone very specific is responsible. But that reckoning is centuries away. For now, the system worked, and it worked spectacularly. Then, around the 2nd century of the Common Era, El Mirador declined. The great city that had dominated the Petén for 400 years was largely abandoned by around the year 150. Why is unresolved? Some researchers point to environmental damage, the enormous quantities of firewood required to burn limestone into lime plaster, and the erosion of hillside soils into the swamps that the city depended on for farming. Others suspect a prolonged dry period, or the disruption of trade routes, or conflict, or some combination of all of it. Whatever the cause, the collapse of El Mirador is worth noting, because it tells us something that often gets lost. The famous Maya collapse of the 9th century was not unique. It was not even the first. Maya cities rose and fell repeatedly across 2,500 years. This was a civilization of many centers and no single capital. And its history is a history of shifting fortunes, not one long ascent followed by one catastrophic drop. What happened after El Mirador was not an ending, it was a redistribution. Power flowed south and east, to smaller centers that had been growing quietly in its shadow. One of them sat on a low ridge between 2 seasonal swamps, about 60 kilometers away. It had been occupied since perhaps the 8th century before the Common Era, a modest place with a modest ceremonial platform. Its ancient name was Mutal, We know it as Tikal, and its greatest days were about to begin. The period that archaeologists call the Classic runs from roughly the year 250 to the year 900, and it is the 6.5 centuries in which everything we most associate with the Maya reached its full expression. Carved, dated monuments, painted polychrome pottery, corbelled vaults, dynastic histories running back through named generations, wars, alliances, marriages, betrayals, all of it recorded in stone by people who very much wanted us to know about it. The first thing to understand about the political landscape is that there was no Maya Empire. There never was. This is one of the most persistent misconceptions, and shedding it changes the whole picture. What existed instead were dozens of independent kingdoms, each centered on a city, each ruled by its own dynasty, each fiercely conscious of its own identity. They shared a religion, a calendar, a writing system, and an artistic tradition, in much the way the city-states of classical Greece shared theirs. And like the Greeks, they spent a great deal of energy fighting one another. At any given moment during the Classic period, there were probably between 40 and 60 such kingdoms in the lowlands, some no larger than a market town with its hinterland, a few controlling territories of several thousand square kilometers, and the loyalty of a dozen lesser lords. Nor did they all speak the same language. The Mayan language family had already been diversifying for 2,000 years. A traveler from the Guatemalan highlands, speaking an ancestor of Quiche, would have found the Yucatec of the northern plains largely unintelligible. The written script, however, was based principally on a prestige language that scholars call Classic Choltian, and functioned as a kind of shared literary standard across the whole region, rather as Latin did in medieval Europe. At the top of each kingdom stood the Kuhul Ajau. Beneath him, a court, the Sajal, provincial governors and war leaders, the Akuhun, keepers of books and scribal officials, some of whom signed their work with evident pride, military commanders, priests, who were often close relatives of the king, and behind them all the vast apparatus of servants, artisans, guards, cooks, feather workers, potters, and stonemasons that a royal household required. Royal women were not decorative. Several ruled in their own right, and many more wielded very substantial influence. Lady Sixsky of Naranjo arrived from Dos Pilas in the year 682, apparently to restore a broken dynasty, and for decades afterwards, monuments show her standing in the classic posture of victory, 1 foot upon a bound captive. Lady Kaabel of El Peru Waka held the title Kalumte, Supreme Warlord, a rank above that of her own husband. The women of Palenque appear repeatedly at the very center of dynastic legitimacy, mothers, through whom the right to rule descended. Now step down from the palace and into the ordinary world, because the overwhelming majority of Maya people never set foot in a throne room. Most lived in scattered household compounds spread across the countryside, and even within the cities. This is another thing that surprises people. Maya cities did not have crowded street grids like Rome or Teotihuacan. They were green cities, low density and spread out, with clusters of houses set among garden plots and orchards, and stands of managed forest. LiDAR surveys have shown just how thoroughly the landscape was worked. Terraces climbing hillsides, raised fields in the wetlands, divided by drainage canals, reservoirs at every scale, from great civic tanks to household catchments, quarries, causeways, walls, house platforms in their tens of thousands. The 2024 survey of a stretch of Campeche made the point with particular force. Researchers reanalyzed laser data originally gathered for a forest carbon study and found not only thousands of unrecorded structures, but an entire substantial city with pyramids, plazas, a ball court, and a dammed reservoir sitting beside a modern highway in an area archaeologists had assumed was nearly empty. They named it Valeriana, after a nearby lagoon. since its real name is lost. It had perhaps 30 to 50,000 inhabitants at its height, which is more than live in that district today. A typical family compound held 4 or 5 buildings, arranged around a small courtyard, sleeping houses, a kitchen, a storage building, perhaps a shrine. The buildings themselves would look familiar to anyone who has visited a Maya village in the last 100 years, because the design has barely changed. A low platform of stone and earth to lift the floor above the mud, walls of poles, sometimes plastered, a steep thatched roof, its pitch calculated to shed the tropical downpours, dark inside from the smoke of the cooking fire, that same smoke keeping the thatch dry and the insects out. Beneath the floor, the dead. Maya households buried their ancestors under the house, often directly under the sleeping bench. The family did not leave its dead behind. It lay down on top of them each night and spoke to them and fed them offerings on the appropriate days. When a house was rebuilt, which happened every generation or two, the new floor went over the old, and the burials accumulated in layers, so that after 200 years, a family was quite literally living on the compressed remains of its own history. The day began before dawn. The first sound in any Maya settlement was the grinding of maize, kernels soaked overnight in lime water, then crushed on a stone, metate with a stone mano, back and forth, until they became a smooth dough. It was hard, monotonous work, done by women, taking several hours daily, and the wear it left on wrists and knees is visible in skeletons across the whole region. From that dough came the food of Mesoamerica, tortillas cooked on a flat clay griddle, tamales, dough wrapped in leaves and steamed, often with beans or meat or squash seeds folded inside, which were probably more common than tortillas for most of Maya history. Atole, a warm maize drink, sometimes flavored with chili, sometimes with honey. Around these staples came black beans, several kinds of squash, chili peppers of many varieties, tomatoes, avocados, sweet potato, manioc, and a great range of fruits, papaya, guava, soursop, the sweet white pulp of the cacao pod, and the plum-sized fruit of the sapodilla tree. Meat was occasional rather than daily for most families. White-tailed deer, hunted with spear and later with blowgun and dart, peccary, armadillo, agouti and paca, turtles and freshwater fish, and, near the coast, an enormous quantity of shellfish and salted marine fish traded inland. Domestic turkeys, and the small hairless dogs which were fattened on maize and eaten at feasts. Honey, from stingless bees kept in hollow logs, which the Maya husbanded with great care, and which flavored both food and a fermented ceremonial drink called balke. And cacao. Cacao deserves its own moment, because to the Maya, it was not a confection. It was wealth, medicine, ritual, and pleasure combined. The pods grow directly from the trunk of a small understory tree that requires shade, humidity, and protection from wind, which restricted cultivation to particular favored places: the Pacific Piedmont, the river valleys of Belize, the Gulf lowlands. The beans were fermented, dried, roasted, and ground, then whisked with water, chili, vanilla, honey, or the flowers of certain trees, and poured repeatedly from one vessel to another, held high above it, to raise a thick foam. The foam was the point. That is what people prized. We know the recipe, partly because the Maya wrote it on their cups. Painted cylindrical vases carry a dedicatory text along the rim, naming the owner and stating what the vessel was for. This is the drinking cup for tree-fresh cacao. This is for maize gruel. When chemists tested residues inside such vessels, they found theobromine. The label matched the contents. It is a small thing, but there is something quietly delightful about it. A 1,500-year-old cup that says what it holds, and holds what it says. Cacao beans also served as currency. Small purchases across Mesoamerica were reckoned in beans, and the Spanish recorded prices in them well into the colonial period. Counterfeiting existed too. Hollowed-out shells filled with earth, passed off in the market by the unscrupulous. Which brings us to trade, and to the extraordinary reach of Maya commerce. There were no pack animals, and no wheeled carts. Goods moved on human backs along forest trails or by canoe, and canoes did an enormous amount of the work. Great dugouts, some carved from a single mahogany trunk and capable of carrying 20 or 30 people plus cargo, worked the rivers of the interior and hugged the coast of the peninsula. When Christopher Columbus, on his fourth voyage in 1502, encountered a Maya trading canoe off the coast of Honduras, he described a vessel as long as a galley, with a palm-thatched shelter amidships, loaded with cotton cloth, obsidian blades, copper bells, wooden swords set with stone edges, and cacao. Some of his crew noticed that when a few beans spilled, the traders scrambled to retrieve every one, as though gathering fallen coins. The trade network moved obsidian from the highland sources at El Chayal and Ixtepeque, jade from the Motagua Valley, salt from the great coastal pans of northern Yucatan, quetzal feathers from the cloud forests, jaguar pelts, marine shell from both coasts, stingray spines used in bloodletting, pyrite for mirrors, cinnabar and hematite for pigment, cotton, honey, and fine painted pottery which traveled hundreds of kilometers as elite gifts. Markets have proved harder to find archaeologically than one might expect, largely because a market leaves behind mostly empty ground, but soil chemistry has helped. At several sites, researchers have tested the phosphate and zinc levels in plaza surfaces and found the distinctive chemical residue of organic goods sold in fixed locations, the shadow of a marketplace that vanished 1,000 years ago. Stand in one for a moment, at mid-morning. The plaza is bright, its plaster reflecting a hard white light. Under palm frond awnings, goods are laid out on woven mats. Piles of chili, glossy black obsidian blades ranked by size. Bundles of cotton thread dyed with indigo and cochineal. Live turkeys with their legs tied. Gourds of honey, folded lengths of cloth, tobacco, copal resin for burning, salt in loaves. The air smells of wood smoke and crushed herbs and sweat and roasting maize. Somewhere, a group of men are unloading a canoe cargo, calling to each other in the flat lowland accent. Children weave between the mats. A dog is asleep in the only shade. Above it all rise the pyramids, red-painted and impossibly steep, and beyond them, in every direction, the green. The people in this market are dressed according to what they are. A farmer wears a simple loincloth of cotton, perhaps a cloak knotted at the shoulder. His wife wears a long wrapped skirt, and, in the lowlands where the heat is heavy, often nothing above it. Both are barefoot or in plain sandals. A noble is another matter entirely. Cotton woven so finely it takes months to produce. Brocade patterns worked into the cloth. Sandals with elaborate heel guards. Jade at the ears, jade at the wrists, jade at the throat. Jade beads inlaid into the front teeth, drilled into the enamel with a bow drill and set with resin. Headdresses built up from wood and cloth and stucco, and topped with the meter-long emerald tail feathers of the quetzal, birds that were caught, plucked and released, because killing one carried a penalty. And the body itself was worked. Maya elites regarded the natural human head as unfinished. Infants had their skulls gently bound between padded boards in the first months of life, producing a long, elegant, backward-sloping profile that matched the shape of a maize cob and the head of the maize god. Eyes were deliberately encouraged to cross, sometimes by hanging a small bead of resin against the forehead of a baby, because a slight squint was considered beautiful. Ears, lips, and the septum were pierced for ornaments. Skin was painted, red for warriors and rulers, black for priests and for young unmarried men. glue for those about to be sacrificed. To our eyes, it can sound severe. To theirs, it was simply what a properly finished person looked like, and every culture on Earth has done a version of it. Underneath the ornament, though, the bones tell a plainer story. Studies of classic period skeletons show that elite individuals were taller, better nourished, and lived measurably longer than commoners. Nobles ate more meat and more cacao. Farmers ate more maize and more of everything else that grew close to home. Both suffered dental wear from grit ground off the stone metate. Both carried parasites. Infant mortality everywhere was appalling by our standards, and a woman who survived her childbearing years might expect to reach her 40s or 50s. They lived, in short, like most pre-modern peoples. Closely, physically, seasonally, with hard labor and real hunger at the edge of the dry season, and with an inner life so rich and so precisely mapped that we are still, 500 years later, only beginning to read it. A Maya life had a shape to it, and the shape was marked at every stage. It began with a name, and the name began with a date. When a child was born, a specialist was consulted to determine the day sign of the birth, and that sign carried implications for the child's character and prospects that everyone took seriously. Among the Yucatec Maya, children received a personal name, a paternal name, and a maternal name, and later, on marriage, a further one, so that a person accumulated identity as they moved through life. Infancy involved the shaping of the head, gently and gradually, with the padded boards we spoke of earlier. It involved a small bead hung against the forehead to encourage the crossing of the eyes, and at 3 or 4 months, in a ceremony the Yucatec called the Hetzmek, the child was carried on the hip for the first time and presented with the tools of its future. For a boy, an axe, a digging stick, a book. For a girl, a spindle, a grinding stone, a needle. Childhood was short by our standards and largely consisted of learning by doing. Boys went to the milpa with their fathers, learned to clear and burn and plant with a pointed stick, learned to set a snare, learned to handle a canoe. Girls ground maize, carried water, learned the backstrap loom. Among the elite, a very few learned to write, and that education was long, difficult, and jealously guarded. Adolescence brought its own right. Boys of noble families lived apart from their parents in communal houses, painted black, until marriage. There is a description in Landa of a ceremony in which a white bead was removed from the head of a girl who had come of age, and a shell that had been tied to her waist since infancy was cut away by her mother, which sounds, when you read it, exactly as tender and awkward as such moments always are. Marriage was arranged, usually through a matchmaker, and involved negotiation over gifts and bride service, with the young husband commonly working for his wife's family for a period of years before the couple established a household of their own. Divorce existed and appears to have been reasonably straightforward. Polygamy was practiced among the elite, largely as a diplomatic instrument. Illness was met with a body of medical practice that was more effective than it is often given credit for. Maya healers used hundreds of plant preparations, many of which have since been shown to contain genuinely active compounds. Bark of the balsam tree as an antiseptic dressing, preparations from tobacco as an emetic and a poultice, sweat baths, small domed structures of stone in which steam was raised by pouring water over heated rocks, used for purification, for the treatment of fever and rheumatic pain, and above all for recovery after childbirth. Bone setting was practiced skillfully, and healed fractures in the skeletal record are often well aligned. There was also surgery of an astonishing kind, though not for medical reasons. Maya dentists drilled precise circular cavities into the front surface of living teeth, using a tubular drill and abrasive, and set jade or pyrite discs into them with a natural cement made from plant resins and mineral. The work is exact. The drilling stops short of the pulp with a margin that suggests real anatomical knowledge, and modern examination has found that the cements involved had antibacterial properties. People walked around with jeweled smiles, and their dentists knew what they were doing. But illness was never understood as purely physical. Sickness was imbalance, or the consequence of an offense, or the work of a hostile spirit, and treatment therefore combined the herbal with the ritual, chanting, divination by casting seeds and crystals, the burning of copal, the recitation of formulas naming the illness and commanding it to leave. Some of those incantations were written down after the conquest and survive in the Yucatec manuscripts known as the Books of Chilambalam, alongside prophecy, history and astronomy, compiled in secret across generations by Maya scribes who had learned the Latin alphabet and used it to preserve everything they could. Everyday life had its music. Not the incidental accompaniment we tend to imagine, but a substantial tradition. The Maya played long wooden trumpets, conch shell horns, flutes and whistles of clay, in enormous variety, ocarinas shaped like animals and gods, panpipes, turtle shell drums struck with antlers, tall ceramic drums with skin heads, gourd rattles, and rasps of notched bone. The murals at Bonampak show an entire ensemble in procession, and the arrangement of the players tells us they had ideas about balance and section. They danced, constantly and formally, in costumes and masks, sometimes for days. Certain dances were performed only by the king. Others belonged to particular gods, particular months, particular occupations. Some involved snakes. One, recorded in the colonial period and still performed today in modified form, dramatizes the capture and sacrifice of a warrior who is permitted to speak for himself at length before the end. And there was theater. The Rabbanal Achi, a Quiche dance drama preserved through oral transmission and written down in the 19th century, is the only substantially surviving pre-conquest theatrical work in the Americas, and it is still performed in the town it belongs to. Death, when it came, returned a person to the house. Ordinary people were buried beneath the floors of their homes, usually in a flexed or extended position, with a jade or shell bead placed in the mouth as payment for the journey, and a few possessions alongside: a pot, a tool, some food. The living continued to speak to them. Ancestors were consulted, appeased and honored, and remained members of the household in a way that had nothing metaphorical about it. Kings, of course, went into pyramids, with jade and cinnabar and painted vessels, and sometimes with attendants sacrificed to accompany them. But the principle was the same at every level of society, only the scale differed. You buried your dead beneath the place where you lived, and you built on top of them, and their presence beneath the floor was the reason the floor was yours. To understand any of this properly, though, you have to step back from the household and look upward, because everything the Maya did, from the position of a doorway, to the day chosen for a wedding, to the direction a body was laid, followed from a single detailed picture of how the universe was put together. That picture began with a question every civilization eventually asks: why is there anything at all, and what are we for? The Maya answer survives most completely in the Popol Vuh, the book of the Quiche Maya, of the Guatemalan highlands, written down in the alphabet in the middle of the 16th century, by people determined that their traditions should not be lost. It preserves stories far older, some of which, as we have seen, were already being painted on walls 1600 years earlier. In the beginning, it says, there was only the sky above and the sea below, and both were still, and nothing had a name. Two beings, the framer and the shaper, spoke together in the darkness, and when they said earth, earth rose out of the water. Mountains, valleys, rivers, forest, all of it arrived at a word. Then they wanted someone to speak back, someone to keep the days and offer prayer and say the names of the gods aloud, because a god unnamed is a god forgotten. They made the animals first. The animals could only howl and squawk, so they were sent to live in the ravines and forests, and to be eaten. They made a person out of mud, who dissolved. They made people out of wood, who walked and multiplied but had no memory and no gratitude, and these were destroyed in a great flood, while their own household objects rose up and beat them, the grinding stones complaining that they had been ground upon, the cooking pots that they had been burned. The survivors fled into the trees, and the Popol Vuh says that is where monkeys come from. At last the gods found the right material. 4 animals brought word of a mountain full of maize. The grandmother goddess ground the white maize, and the yellow maize 9 times, and from that dough she made human flesh. We are, in this account, made of food, not shaped from clay by a distant potter, but formed from the same substance that we then spend our lives planting, tending, and eating. And that circularity sits at the very center of Maya religion. Human beings owe the gods their bodies. The debt is repaid through nourishment, incense, offerings, blood. Woven through the epic is the story of the hero twins, Hunahpu and Xbalanque, whose father was murdered by the lords of the underworld. Summoned down into Xibalba, the place of fright, the twins survive a sequence of deadly trials: a house of cold, a house of jaguars, a house of blades that move on their own, a house of bats where one twin loses his head. They win by cunning rather than strength, tricking the underworld lords into a trap of their own asking, and having defeated death, they rise into the sky as the sun and the moon. It is not a story about heroism, as a European audience might expect it. It is a story about intelligence, patience, and the refusal to accept that death has the final word. The Maya cosmos was structured in 3 great layers. Above, the celestial realm, 13 levels of it, home to the sun and moon and the wandering planets, and to a vast bird deity who perched at the top of the world tree. Below, Xibalba, 9 levels of watery darkness, reach through caves and cenotes and the still surfaces of pools. Between them, the earth, which was the back of a colossal crocodilian creature floating upon the sea, its rough hide, the mountains and ridges of the visible land. At the center of the world stood the saber tree, the great silk cotton tree, whose actual living form the Maya would have known intimately. A pale gray trunk running up straight and unbranched for 30 meters before spreading into a wide, flat crown far above the rest of the canopy. Its roots reached into the underworld, its trunk stood in the world of the living, its branches held up the sky. 4 more trees stood at the corners of creation, each associated with a color: red in the east where the sun rose, white in the north, black in the west, yellow in the south, and blue-green at the center. This is why Maya buildings are aligned the way they are, and why the direction you face during a ritual is not a detail, but the whole point. The gods themselves were many and slippery. Trying to reduce them to a tidy pantheon distorts them, because Maya deities merge, split, take different aspects at different times of day and different points in the calendar, and appear as both young and old, male and female, single and quadruple. Itzamnaj was the aged creator god, patron of writing and learning, sometimes shown as a wrinkled man with a long nose, sometimes as a great celestial bird. Kinichahau was the sun, who crossed the sky by day and traveled the underworld by night in the form of a jaguar, which is why the jaguar was associated with night, kingship, and the world below all at once. Chak was the rain, a figure with a long drooping nose and a lightning axe, and when thunder rolled over the Peten, it was Chak striking the clouds. The maize god, young and beautiful and endlessly reborn, was the model of ideal human form, and the source of that elongated skull shaped the elite so carefully cultivated. Ixchel, in her various guises, presided over the moon, over weaving, over medicine and childbirth. And then there was the pyramid. A Maya pyramid is not a tomb in the Egyptian sense, though kings were often buried inside them, it is a mountain. Specifically, it is the sacred mountain of creation, the place where maize came from, rebuilt by human hands in a landscape that in the lowlands is almost perfectly flat. The temple on its summit is the cave at the mountain's mouth, the doorway into the earth. When a priest disappeared through that doorway with a censer of copal smoke trailing behind him, everyone watching from the plaza below understood exactly what he was doing. The engineering was constrained by a single limitation. The Maya never developed the true arch. Instead, they used the corbel vault, courses of stone stepped inwards from both sides until they nearly meet, capped by a single flat stone across the gap. It is a heavy, inefficient solution. It requires walls of enormous thickness and produces interior rooms that are narrow, dark, and high, like a stone tent. Some Maya buildings are 90% solid mass and 10% room. Rather than fight the limitation, they made it beautiful. The narrow, gloomy chambers of a temple summit heightened the sense of entering somewhere other. The huge wall mass allowed builders to pile the exterior with decoration. And on top of many temples, they raised a roof comb, a lattice of stone standing up to 15 meters above the roofline, carrying vast sculptured images of the ruler and the gods, painted in reds and blues and yellows, visible from far out across the forest canopy. Every surface, or almost every surface, was covered in lime plaster and painted. This is the single hardest thing for modern visitors to imagine, because what survives is bare grey stone in a green forest, and the reality was closer to a Mediterranean city under a tropical sun. Dazzling white plazas, deep red buildings, painted stucco masks, colored textiles hanging in doorways. Tikal at midday would have been almost painful to look at. Producing that plaster came at a cost that the Maya themselves may not have fully appreciated. Limestone must be burned at very high temperature to become lime, and burning it consumes staggering amounts of wood. Estimates for some major sites run to many tons of timber for a single building's surface. In a forest that seemed infinite, the arithmetic did not look alarming. Over 8 centuries, in a landscape also being cleared for farming, it added up. Within these spaces, the rituals unfolded, and here we should be honest and also careful, because this is the aspect of Maya culture that popular treatments seize upon and distort most badly. Blood was central, but the blood that mattered most was the king's own. Royal bloodletting was the fundamental act of Maya piety. Using a stingray spine, an obsidian blade, or a length of cord set with thorns, rulers and their consorts drew blood from their own bodies, from the earlobes, the tongue, and in the case of male rulers, the penis. The blood was caught on strips of bark paper and burned, so that the smoke carried it upwards. There is a famous carved lintel from Yaxchilan, now in the British Museum, showing Lady Kabul Shuk kneeling before her husband, pulling a rope thick with thorns through a hole pierced in her tongue, the blood spattering onto paper in a basket at her knees. Her expression is entirely composed. In the accompanying panel, the smoke rises and forms itself into a serpent, from whose mouth emerges an ancestral warrior. That is the purpose. Pain, endurance, and blood loss, sustained through fasting and sleeplessness, and the smoke of burning copal, produced visions. The vision was the point. Through it, the ruler spoke with the dead and with the gods, and returned with knowledge the community needed. Human sacrifice did occur. Denying it would be dishonest. The evidence is unambiguous, in art, in texts, and in physical remains. Captured enemy lords were the most common victims, sometimes held for years and displayed at intervals before being killed at a dedication ceremony. There is evidence too for the sacrifice of children in certain contexts, particularly connected with rain and with the cenotes. But scale matters, and so does context. Maya practice was on nothing like the industrial scale later recorded for the Mexica of Tenochtitlan. It was episodic, tied to particular moments. Accession, the dedication of a building, the completion of a calendrical cycle, victory in war. It was framed as the repayment of a cosmic debt, the same debt the king paid from his own body. And the Maya were not unusual in their era. Human sacrifice appears in Bronze Age China, in Iron Age Europe, in the ancient Near East, in Polynesia. It is uncomfortable, and it is also completely ordinary in world history, and there is no honest way to hold the Maya to a standard we do not apply elsewhere. The Great Cenote at Chichen Itza is the most famous site of such offerings. Dredged in the early 20th century by the American consul Edward Thompson, who bought the site and simply started hauling up its contents, it yielded gold discs, jade, copper bells, wooden objects preserved by the water, incense, textiles, and human remains. Analysis of those remains found men, women, and children, with a notable proportion of young males. Recent ancient DNA work on individuals from a nearby Chultan, a subterranean chamber, identified a group consisting entirely of boys, including 2 sets of identical twins, which resonates unmistakably with the hero twins of the Popol Vuh. Ritual, in other words, was following story. And then there was the ball game, which sat exactly at the meeting point of sport, politics, and cosmology. Nearly every Maya city of any size had at least one court, and the design is recognizable everywhere. A long alley flanked by 2 parallel structures with sloping or vertical walls. Chichen Itza's Great Ball Court is the largest in Mesoamerica, 168 meters long, its walls carrying stone rings set high above the playing surface, and its acoustics so peculiar that a whisper at one end carries clearly to the other. The ball was solid rubber, ranging from something like a large grapefruit up to objects weighing several kilograms. Players struck it with hips, thighs, and forearms, wearing thick protective belts of leather and padded cotton, and knee and elbow guards. Using the hands was generally forbidden. Getting hit by that ball at speed could break ribs, and according to some accounts, kill. The game reenacted the struggle of the hero twins against the lords of Xibalba, the ball itself moving like the sun through the sky and down into the underworld. It was also, sometimes, a formal conclusion to war. Captured lords were dressed for the game, forced to play, and sacrificed afterwards. The carved panels at Chichen Itza show precisely this, one player kneeling headless, while serpents spring from his neck. But it was not only that. It was also just a game, played in villages, wagered on heavily, argued about, enjoyed. Spanish chroniclers describe crowds betting cloth, feathers, houses, and land on the outcome, and occasionally themselves. Both things were true at once. The Maya were entirely capable of holding a ritual and a Saturday afternoon in the same hand, and it is worth remembering that when the temptation arises to imagine them as a people who lived permanently inside solemn ceremony, they laughed, they gambled, they mocked their neighbors. On a painted vase from Naranjo, a court dwarf appears alongside the king, and on another, a group of underworld deities are shown behaving like drunks at a party. There is a great deal of humor in Maya art, once you know to look for it. Their humor rarely survives in stone. What survives in stone, in enormous quantity, is dates. And to understand why a civilization would carve so many of them, you have to understand what the Maya thought time actually was. For us, time is a line. It began somewhere behind us and runs away ahead, and each moment is fresh, unrepeatable, gone. For the Maya, time was a machine of interlocking wheels. It turned, its patterns returned, and each unit of time was not an empty container, but a living presence with its own character, carried across the sky like a burden on a traveler's back. That image is not a metaphor imposed by scholars. It appears directly in Maya art, where the periods of time are shown as figures with thumb lines across their foreheads, hauling the days along. When one period ended, one bearer set down his load, and another picked it up. If time has character, then knowing which day it is becomes a matter of the highest practical importance. A day is not neutral. It is favorable or dangerous, suitable for planting or for war, or for marriage, or for nothing at all. Get it wrong, and the consequences are not merely inconvenient. So they counted, and to count well, they needed a mathematics. The Maya system is elegant, and once explained, obvious. It uses just 3 symbols, a dot for 1, a bar for 5, and a shell-shaped glyph for 0. Numbers up to 19 are built by stacking bars and dots. 3 is 3 dots. 7 is a bar with 2 dots above it. 19 is 3 bars and 4 dots. Beyond that, the system goes vertical and becomes positional, exactly as our own decimal system does, except in base 20 rather than base 10. The bottom position counts units. The position above it counts 20s. Above that, in the calendrical version, a slight irregularity is introduced, so that the third position counts 360 rather than 400, because 360 is much closer to a solar year. Above that, multiplication by 20 resumes. Base 20, incidentally, is simply what happens when a people counts on fingers and toes rather than fingers alone. Several Maya languages preserve the logic in their words for number, and the sign for 20 in some contexts is a complete human being. The concept of 0 is the part that tends to astonish. 0 as a placeholder, and as a number in its own right, is genuinely difficult, and most of the world's mathematical traditions never arrived at it independently. It appears in Mesoamerica no later than the 1st century before the Common Era, several centuries before it appears in India, and roughly 1,000 years before it reached Western Europe through Arabic intermediaries. 2 civilizations, entirely unaware of each other's existence, separated by an ocean neither knew how to cross, each grasped the same difficult abstraction. With this arithmetic, the Maya built calendars, and it is here that their intellectual culture reaches its most extraordinary. There were 3 principal systems, running simultaneously. The first is the Tzolk'in, the count of days, a cycle of 260 days, made by combining a number from 1 to 13 with one of 20 named days. Each morning, both wheels advance. 1 imix is followed by 2 ik, then 3 akbal, and so on. And because 13 and 20 share no common factor, the same combination does not recur for 260 days. Nobody is entirely certain why 260. Several explanations have been proposed, none conclusive. It approximates the length of human pregnancy. It matches the interval between the 2 annual zenith passages of the Sun at around 15 degrees north latitude, where the Sun stands directly overhead and objects cast no shadow. It corresponds roughly to a growing season for maize in parts of the region. It may be all of these, or none. What is certain is that this calendar is the oldest continuously used in the Americas, and that in the highlands of Guatemala, there are day keepers who are counting it tonight, unbroken, having survived conquest, colonization, and civil war. The second calendar is the Hab, the vague year, 365 days, divided into 18 months of 20 days each, plus a final short period of 5 days at the end. Those 5 extra days, the Wayeb, were considered dangerous. The barrier between worlds was thin. People stayed indoors, avoided washing or combing their hair, refrained from important activity, and waited for the year to right itself. The Hab does not include a leap day. It therefore drifts against the true solar year by about a quarter of a day annually. The Maya knew this perfectly well. They simply chose not to correct it, because the integrity of the numerical structure mattered more to them then alignment with the seasons, and because they had other ways of tracking the sun with great precision. Run the Tzolk'in and the Hab together, and they generate a combined date, and that combination does not repeat for 52 Hab years, a period known as the calendar round. 52 years is a plausible long human lifetime, and the completion of a calendar round was a major event across Mesoamerica. But 52 years is not enough for a dynasty that wishes to record its history precisely, or for a people who think in vast spans of cosmic time. So the Maya built a third system, and this one is unique to them. The long count is an absolute tally of days elapsed since a fixed starting point. It counts in units: the Kakin, 1 day; the Winal, 20 days; the Tun, 18 Winals, or 360 days; the Katun, 20 Tuns, just under 20 years; and the Baktun, 20 Katuns, a little under 395 years. A long count date is written as 5 numbers, and it identifies a single day out of thousands of years with no ambiguity whatsoever. The starting point of the count corresponds, in our calendar, to a day in August of the year 3114 before the Common Era. That was not a date in Maya history. It was the mythological creation of the current world, the moment when the previous cycle ended and the present one was set turning. And it is the long count that produced the strangest afterlife any ancient calendar has ever had. On the 21st of December, 2012, the count reached 13 Bakaktuns. Because 13 was a significant number, and because a monument from the site of Tortuguero mentions something happening on that day, a small industry grew up around the claim that the Maya had predicted the end of the world. They had done nothing of the kind. The long count did not stop. It simply rolled over, exactly as an odometer does. Maya texts themselves refer to dates far beyond 2012. A monument at Palenque casually mentions an anniversary that falls in the year 4772. And the Tortuguero text, badly damaged and hard to read, appears to refer to a god descending, in the ordinary language of a period-ending ceremony. The prophecy was not Maya, it was ours, projected backwards onto them, and the modern Maya communities, who found themselves fielding questions about the apocalypse, were by most accounts patient about it and slightly bemused. What the Maya genuinely did achieve with their sky watching is more impressive than any prophecy. They observed without lenses. They used bare eyes, patience, generations of accumulated records, and simple sighting devices, crossed sticks, notches in a wall, the alignment of one building's doorway with another's corner. The results are remarkable. Their calculated value for the mean lunar month is accurate to within a fraction of a second of the modern figure. Their tables for the synodic cycle of Venus, preserved in the Dresden Codex, track the planet's appearances as morning star and evening star across 500 years, with a built-in correction for accumulated error, and the residual drift over that whole span is a matter of hours. They tracked Mars. They recorded eclipse warnings, tables identifying the moments when a solar or lunar eclipse became possible, so that the appropriate rituals could be prepared. Venus was of particular concern, and not as a symbol of love. To the Maya, it was a dangerous, martial body, and its first reappearance as morning star after inferior conjunction was an especially perilous moment. Several recorded wars, including a famous conflict between Dos Pilas and Ceibal, were timed to Venus events, so consistently that scholars refer to Star Wars in the epigraphic literature. They built for the sky as well. At Huexactun, a group of 3 small temples stands opposite an observation platform, positioned so that from the platform the sun rises behind the northern temple at the June solstice, behind the central one at the equinoxes, and behind the southern one in December. At Chichen Itza, the round tower called the Caracol has windows whose sightlines correspond to the extreme northerly and southerly settings of Venus. And at that same site, the great stepped pyramid of Kukulkan is built so that on the afternoons around the equinoxes, the descending edges of its terraces throw a serrated shadow down the northern balustrade, which joins a carved serpent head at the base, so that a snake of light appears to slither down the pyramid and into the earth. Thousands of people gather to watch it still. All of this knowledge, astronomical, calendrical, historical, medical, and mythological, was written down in the only fully developed writing system ever independently invented in the Americas. Maya script is not an alphabet, and it is not simple pictures. It is a mixed system, combining logograms, signs that represent whole words, with a syllabary of signs representing consonant plus vowel combinations. There are around 800 known signs, of which perhaps 200 to 300 were in common use at any period. Scribes assembled these into glyph blocks, roughly square clusters read in a standard order, and the blocks themselves were normally arranged in paired columns, read left to right across the pair, then down to the next row. Within a block, the signs are fitted together like a puzzle, resized and rotated, and occasionally merged, so that one sign's outline becomes part of another's. That flexibility is what makes the script so difficult and so beautiful. A scribe could write the same word in several different ways, purely with a logogram, purely with syllabic signs, or with a logogram plus a phonetic hint to guide the reader. Choosing among these was an aesthetic decision. Maya writing is calligraphy in the fullest sense, and the finest scribes were high-status individuals, sometimes sons of kings, who signed their work. They wrote on stone monuments, on carved wooden lintels of sapodilla wood, on jade, bone, shell, and painted pottery, on the plastered walls of buildings, and above all on books. Maya books were made from the inner bark of the wild fig tree, beaten thin, sized with lime plaster, and folded like a screen, so that the whole volume opened out into a long, continuous strip painted on both sides. They were bound between covers of wood or jaguar hide. Every city of consequence had libraries of them, and a class of people whose work was to write, copy, and consult them. 4 survive. 4, out of what must have been many thousands. Some were lost simply to time, because bark paper in a tropical climate does not last. But the greater part of the loss was deliberate, and we will come to that, and to the man who lit the fire. What we have are the Dresden Codex, the finest of them, containing astronomical tables of extraordinary accuracy, the Madrid Codex, mainly concerned with ritual and divination, and the round of daily work, the Paris Codex, fragmentary, dealing with ceremony and prophecy, and the Maya Codex of Mexico, a small fragment of a Venus table, which was doubted for half a century after its murky appearance on the antiquities market in the 1960s, and which rigorous testing in 2018 finally confirmed as genuine and as the oldest surviving book in the Americas. Alongside these, the corpus of carved inscriptions runs to many thousands of texts, and for most of the modern era, all of them were silent. The story of how they began to speak is one of the great intellectual detective stories, and it took the better part of a century. The first breakthroughs, in the late 19th century, were calendrical. A German librarian named Ernst Fürstemann, working with the Dresden Codex in his own institution, worked out the numerical system, the zero, the long count, and the Venus tables, without ever leaving Saxony. That meant scholars could read the dates on Maya monuments with confidence long before they could read anything else. It also, unfortunately, produced a comfortable and mistaken conclusion that if the texts were full of dates and astronomy, then the Maya must have been peaceful priest astronomers, contemplating the heavens, uninterested in the grubby business of politics. This picture was defended vigorously for decades, particularly by the enormously influential English scholar Eric Thompson, who dominated the field until his death in 1975, and who insisted that the script was symbolic rather than phonetic. His authority delayed the decipherment by a generation. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. In 1952, a young Russian scholar named Yuri Konorazov published a paper arguing that the Maya script was partly phonetic and that the key lay in a much-abused document, an alphabet recorded in the 16th century by the Spanish bishop Diego de Landa, who had asked a Maya informant to write the Spanish letters and had transcribed what he was given. Because his informant had responded with the signs for the sounds of the letter names rather than the letters themselves, the result had been dismissed as nonsense. Konorazov saw that it was not nonsense. It was a syllabary. Landa's informant had been answering correctly. The bishop had asked the wrong question. Cold War politics being what they were, Konorazov's work was met in the West with hostility and accusations of ideological motivation. It took years for the field to accept it. He himself did not set foot in the Maya region until 1990. Meanwhile, a Russian-born American scholar named Tatiana Proskuryakov was studying the monuments of Piedras Negras and noticed a pattern. The dates on each group of stelae clustered within a human lifespan, with recurring intervals between them. What if these were not astronomical records at all, but births, accessions, and deaths? What if the monuments were about people? Her paper of 1960 demolished the peaceful astronomer model in a single stroke. The Maya had been writing history all along. Dynasties, wars, marriages, captures, alliances. From the 1970s onwards, with Konorazov's phonetic key and Proskuryakov's historical insight combined, and with a new generation of epigraphers working collaboratively at workshops in Palenque and Texas, the script fell open. Today, around 90% of Maya texts can be read with reasonable confidence. Consider what that means. A civilization that was, within living memory, entirely mute now, names its own kings, records their birthdays, describes their quarrels, and preserves their boasts. There is scarcely a parallel for it in the study of the ancient world. And what those texts describe, more than anything else, is a story of ambition, rivalry, and war. Maya warfare has been reimagined more than once. For much of the 20th century, it was thought to be minimal, ritualized, a matter of small raids for captives. The decipherment ended that. The texts are full of burnings, axings, the toppling of dynasties and the capture of kings, and the archaeology has confirmed it, uncovering fortification walls, defensive ditches, palisade lines, and massacre deposits. But it did not look like the warfare of the old world, and the differences matter. There were no standing professional armies in the Roman sense. Forces were raised for a campaign and dispersed afterwards, made up of the nobility, who fought as an elite, and levies of farmers who fought as their obligation. The nobility trained from childhood. Everyone else learned enough. The weapons were shaped by what was available. No iron, no bronze. What the Maya had instead was obsidian and flint, and obsidian in particular makes an edge finer than anything a metalsmith can produce. A struck obsidian blade is sharper than a modern scalpel, its cutting edge only a few molecules thick. Its weakness is brittleness, it shatters. So the arsenal ran to thrusting spears with long chipped points. The atlatl, a spear thrower which extends the arm's leverage and sends a light dart across a plaza with real force. Clubs edged with rows of obsidian blades set into wood, and knives of flint. The bow arrived late in the Maya region, becoming common only in the post-classic centuries. Defensively, warriors carried round or rectangular shields of wood and hide, sometimes covered in jaguar pelt, and wore quilted cotton armor soaked in brine, which dried stiff and stopped a dart surprisingly well. The Spanish, when they arrived, adopted it themselves in preference to steel plate in the tropical heat. Battles were fought in the dry season, when the ground was firm and the maize was in. They began with noise, conch trumpets, wooden drums, whistles that mimicked screaming, and the ululation of warriors. They were fought in the open, with darts and spears at range, and then hand to hand. And the objective, more often than not, was not to kill the enemy, but to take him alive. Captives were the currency of Maya war. A lord who could parade a captured rival, name him in an inscription, and have himself depicted standing on the man's back, had won something no amount of territory could match: proof of divine favor, visible to everyone. Some captives were held for many years, brought out at intervals, humiliated at ceremonies, and eventually sacrificed. Kings took their names from such victories. Rulers are frequently identified in texts by the number and identity of the men they had captured, in exactly the way a modern regiment lists its battle honors. There were, nevertheless, campaigns of outright conquest, dynasties extinguished, cities burned and never resettled. The stakes were entirely real, and nowhere were they higher than in the long confrontation between two great powers of the classic lowlands. Tikal sits on a limestone ridge in the northern Petén, in what is now Guatemala, surrounded on several sides by seasonal swamp. Its ancient name, Mutal, appears in its emblem glyph, and it had been inhabited since perhaps 800 years before the Common Era. By the 1st century of the Common Era, it was a substantial center. By the 4th, it was one of the most powerful cities in the Maya world. Its greatness had a material basis. The ridge gave it defensible ground and control of a portage route between two river systems, meaning that trade moving across the peninsula tended to pass through it. It had abundant flint deposits. It had, above all, water, a system of at least 10 major reservoirs, engineered by paving and grading the central plazas so that the entire ceremonial core became a catchment, with rain funneled through channels into tanks lined with plaster, and, as recent work suggests, filtered through beds of quartz sand and zeolite mineral to keep it drinkable. At full capacity, the system held enough for tens of thousands of people through a dry season. The Great Plaza at Tikal is one of the most striking constructed spaces anywhere in the world. Two temple pyramids face each other across it, east and west. Along the northern side stands the North Acropolis, a platform built and rebuilt for over 1,000 years, containing beneath its surface the tombs of generations of kings, each new construction sealing the last, so that the whole mound is a stratified archive of dynasty. Opposite it rises the central Acropolis, a warren of palace courts and residential ranges where the court lived and worked. Set into the plaza and lined along the Acropolis stairs are stelae, upright limestone slabs, some 3 meters high, each carved on the front with a standing ruler in full regalia, and on the sides and back with a hieroglyphic text recording who he was and what he had done. In front of each stands a low, circular altar. Erecting a stela was the standard way of marking the end of a cartoon, that 20-year period, and these monuments give us the dynastic history of Tikal in detail across some 33 recorded rulers. The founder was Yakseheb Zuk, who appears to have established the line around the year 100, or a little before. His successors ruled for 2.5 centuries, expanding the city and the dynasty's reach. Then, in the year 378, something happened at Tikal that changed the entire region, and the inscriptions record it in language that is chillingly matter-of-fact. On a day corresponding to the 16th of January, a person named Siaj Ka'ak, which means fire is born, arrived. He came from the west, and on that same day, the reigning king of Tikal, Chak Tok Ichak, entered the water, a phrase which in Maya usage means that he died. The coincidence is not subtle. The following year, a new king was installed on the Tikal throne. Yaks-nu-nahin, a young man whose father is named in the texts as Spear-thrower Owl, a lord who was not Maya, and who ruled somewhere far to the west. That somewhere was almost certainly Teotihuacan, the vast metropolis in the Valley of Mexico, more than 1,000 kilometers away. At that moment, Teotihuacan was one of the largest cities on Earth, home to perhaps 100,000 people or more, laid out on a rigid grid along a great avenue flanked by enormous pyramids. Its influence extended across Mesoamerica through trade, ideology, and evidently, more direct means. The art at Tikal changes immediately afterwards. Yaks-nu-nahin is portrayed not in Maya dress, but in the costume of a central Mexican warrior, goggle-eyed Tlaloc imagery, a shell platelet helmet, a spear thrower in his hand, shield and darts. Green obsidian from the Pachuca source near Teotihuacan appears in elite burials. Central Mexican architectural forms, the stepped and sloping talud tablero profile, show up on Tikal's buildings. What exactly occurred remains debated, and honestly so. One reading is a straightforward armed intervention, a conquest, or the installation of a client dynasty by force. Another is subtler, arguing that Teotihuacan influence arrived through a local faction that adopted foreign symbolism to legitimize a coup. Recent excavation has added weight to the first view. Beneath a plaza at Tikal, LiDAR revealed a scaled-down replica of a Teotihuacan ritual complex, built in Mexican style, with Mexican construction techniques, and nearby, a burial containing weapons and remains, treated in the central Mexican manner. Whatever the mechanism, the effect was transformative. Tikal became the dominant power of the central lowlands for the next century and a half. Siaj-Kak installed rulers at other cities too, at Waxactun and beyond. Yaks-nu-nahin's son, Siaj-Chan-Kawil, ruled for over 4 decades and left a magnificent monument, Stela 31, on which he stands flanked by 2 portraits of his father in full Teotihuacan war costume, while above them, the founding ancestor looks down from the sky. It is a careful piece of political art, binding the foreign connection and the ancient dynasty into a single, legitimate whole. Tikal's supremacy did not go unchallenged. To the north, in what is now Campeche, a rival was growing. Calakmul lies about 100 kilometers from Tikal, deep in what is today a vast biosphere reserve. Its central pyramid is the largest at the site, rising 45 meters from a base of unusual bulk, and around it spreads a city that may have held 50,000 people, with more than 120 carved stelae, though tragically, most were cut from a soft limestone that has weathered almost to blankness. Calakmul was the seat, for much of the classic period, of the Khan dynasty, the Snake Kings, whose emblem glyph is a serpent head and whose reach extended across the entire lowlands. Their strategy was quite different from Tikal's. Rather than direct rule, they built a network, sponsoring lesser lords, arranging marriages, backing rebellions, installing allies at cities in Tikal's own hinterland. Modern scholars describe the resulting arrangement, without much exaggeration, as 2 superpowers and a shifting field of client states between them. In the year 562, that rivalry produced a catastrophe for Tikal. An inscription records a Star War event directed against the city. The identity of the attacker is not entirely certain. The text implicates Caracol, a large center in what is now Belize, probably acting in concert with Calakmul. Tikal's king Wakchan-Kawil was very likely captured and sacrificed. What followed is known as the Tikal hiatus. For roughly 130 years, from 562 to 692, Tikal erected almost no monuments. Construction slowed. The dynastic record grows thin and uncertain. The city was not abandoned, and it did not lose all its power, but it had been humbled, and its rivals prospered accordingly. Calakmul reached its height under a king named Uknum Chian, remembered as Uknum the Great, who reigned for half a century, from 636. Under him, the snake network extended from the Gulf Coast to the highlands of the south, and at one point, Tikal appears to have been effectively encircled by his allies. One of those allies was particularly galling. Dos Pilas, in the Pitex Batoon region, had been founded by a member of Tikal's own royal family, who then defected and spent the rest of his life making war on his brother. The reversal, when it came, was decisive and rather magnificent. In 682, a man named Jasalv Chan Kawil took the throne of Tikal, and he set about the deliberate reconstruction of his city's prestige. He resumed monument carving after the long silence. He deliberately evoked the ancient past, dating events by anniversaries of long-dead kings, physically excavating and reinterring earlier royal remains, and reusing archaic artistic styles. He was, in the fullest sense, engaged in a project of national revival. On the 5th of August, 695, his forces met those of Calakmul in battle. The Tikal texts record a victory. The capture of the Snake King's war palanquin, along with its enormous effigy of a patron deity, and the defeat, and probably the death, of Calakmul's ruler, Yicha'ak Kak, whose name means claw of fire. Tikal's resurgence over the following century produced the buildings that visitors see today. Jaso Chan Kawil raised Temple 1 on the eastern side of the Great Plaza, 47 meters of steep stacked terraces topped by a 3-chambered temple and a roof comb, once bearing a giant sculpted portrait of himself enthroned. Beneath it, sealed in a vaulted chamber, archaeologists found his tomb. The king laid out on a masonry bench, surrounded by jade in great quantity, pearls, painted vessels, spondylus shell, and a remarkable set of carved bones, one of which shows the maize god paddling a canoe into the underworld, accompanied by animals. His son, Yikin Chan Kawil, went further still, building Temple 4 to the west, which at some 70 meters remains one of the tallest structures ever raised in the pre-Columbian Americas. Climb it now, at dawn, and you emerge above the canopy into a sea of mist, with the roof combs of the other temples breaking through the green like islands, howler monkeys roaring in the half-light, toucans clattering past below you. It is one of the few experiences on Earth that genuinely justifies the word unforgettable. And yet, standing there, it is worth remembering what you are actually looking at. Not a monument to peace or contemplation, but a victory column, a statement in 150,000 tons of hand-carried limestone that Tikal had won. Within 150 years, nobody would be listening. While Tikal and Calakmul maneuvered against each other in the central forests, other kingdoms were producing work of a refinement that neither of the great powers ever matched. Go west, to the foothills where the Chiapas highlands drop towards the plain of the Usumacinta, and you come to Palenque. It is the most beautiful of the Maya cities, and almost everyone who visits agrees. It sits on a natural shelf against a wall of green mountains, with waterfalls running through the site itself, and mist hanging in the trees most mornings. It is smaller than Tikal, more intimate, and its architecture is unlike anything else in the Maya world. Light, elegant, with thin walls made possible by a local innovation in vault construction, wide doorways, and a mansard roof profile that gives the buildings an almost delicate look. Palenque's builders had figured out how to lighten the corbel vault by reducing the mass above it, and their rooms are correspondingly airier and their facades correspondingly more open. They also worked in stucco with a skill that has no rival in the Americas. Portraits modeled in lime plaster survive from Palenque that are, frankly, of a quality one might expect from a Renaissance workshop. Individual faces, soft modeling of the mouth and eyes, a sense of a specific person having sat for the artist. The stucco was painted, mostly in a deep Maya red, with details picked out in blue and yellow. And the city had water. The Ochulam stream runs straight through the middle of it, so Palenque's engineers built a vaulted aqueduct, channeling the river beneath the main plaza, both to control flooding and to free the ground above for building. Elsewhere on the site, researchers have identified a pressurized water feature, a conduit that narrows sharply, which under the right head of water would have driven a fountain. It is the earliest known water pressure system in the New World. Palenque's story is dominated by one man, and by a discovery that took 3 years of digging. Kinich Janab Tikal came to the throne in the year 615, at the age of 12, in the aftermath of a serious defeat that had left the kingdom shaken and its dynastic legitimacy in question. His claim to rule came primarily through his mother, Lady Sak Kuk, and much of the art commissioned during his long reign is concerned with justifying that. Palenque's texts reach back into deep mythological time to establish that female descent had precedent at the very origin of the world. He ruled for 68 years. He was around 80 when he died in 683, which in the 7th century was a remarkable age anywhere on Earth. Under him, Palenque was rebuilt almost entirely. The sprawling palace complex with its courtyards and its curious 4-story tower, the finest of the stucco panels, and finally the stepped pyramid on the southern side of the plaza that the Spanish would later name the Temple of the Inscriptions, for the 617 glyph blocks carved into panels inside its summit shrine. It is one of the longest Maya texts known, and it records the dynasty's history across nearly 2 centuries. For 100 years after the site became known to the outside world, everyone assumed the pyramid was solid. In 1949, a Mexican archaeologist named Alberto Ruz Luye noticed that one of the floor slabs in the summit temple had a double row of holes drilled into it, as though for lifting, and that the interior walls continued downwards beneath the floor rather than stopping at it. He had the slab raised. Beneath it, a stairway, deliberately packed solid with rubble. It took 3 field seasons to clear. The stair descended in 2 flights, turning back on itself, 25 meters down, until it reached the level of the plaza outside, and then continued below it. At the bottom, a small chamber containing a stone box with the remains of 5 or 6 young people, apparently placed there as offerings. And beyond that, sealed by a triangular slab of stone, a doorway. Ruz opened it on the 15th of June 1952 and found a vaulted chamber 9 meters long, its walls carrying stucco figures of the 9 lords of the underworld, and almost entirely filled by an enormous carved sarcophagus. Stalactites had begun to grow from the ceiling in the 14 centuries since anyone had last stood there. Inside the sarcophagus lay Tikal. His face was covered by a mosaic mask of 200 pieces of jade, with eyes of shell and obsidian. There was jade at his wrists, jade rings on every finger, a jade bead in his mouth, and a great collar of jade and shell across his chest. The whole burial had been coated in cinnabar, staining the bones deep red. But the extraordinary thing is the lid. It weighs around 5 tons, and it carries a single carved image, and it is one of the most famous objects in the archaeology of the Americas. A man reclines at the center, in the posture of a falling figure or a newborn, resting on a bowl-shaped mark that in Maya writing means sunset, or the moment of entering the underworld. Above and behind him rises a great cruciform tree, the world tree, with a serpent looped through its branches, and the celestial bird perched at its top. Around the border run astronomical symbols and glyphs. The scene shows Tikal at the instant of death, descending into the underworld, positioned at the base of the world tree along which, like the maize god, he will rise again. That is what the iconography says when read against the rest of Maya art. It has, of course, also generated another interpretation, popularized in the 1960s, which holds that Tikal is an astronaut operating a spacecraft. It is worth saying plainly and without ridicule why that reading fails. Every element on the lid is a standard motif appearing throughout Maya religious art, in contexts that have nothing to do with flight. The accompanying text records a death and a date, and the theory requires assuming that a people who invented writing, zero and a functioning astronomy, could not have designed their own king's tomb. The sarcophagus sides show his ancestors emerging from cracks in the earth as fruit trees, each one named. It is a family portrait, in stone, of a dynasty presenting itself as an orchard. Tikal's son, Kinich Khan Bialam, continued the program, building the group of 3 temples known as the Cross Group, whose inner shrines carry parallel texts describing the birth of the patron gods of Palenque at the beginning of the current world, and linking those births to his own accession. It is theology and propaganda in a single gesture, and it is exquisitely done. 900 kilometers to the southeast, at the far edge of the Maya world, another kingdom was doing something equally distinctive. Copan lies in a fertile river valley, in what is now western Honduras, ringed by hills, at the frontier where Maya territory met other peoples. Its stone was a fine-grained volcanic tuff, softer and more workable than limestone, and its sculptors exploited that ruthlessly. Copan's stelae are not the flat relief carvings of Tikal. They are almost fully three-dimensional, figures standing free of the block, with deeply undercut headdresses, folded arms, ornament piled upon ornament, until the surface becomes a thicket. Nowhere else in the Maya world did sculpture come so close to statuary. The dynasty was founded in the year 426 by a lord named Kinich Calakmul, Radiant First Quetzalcoatl. Where he came from has been much argued. Isotope analysis of the skeleton believed to be his suggests he grew up in the central Patin, probably in the region of Tikal, and his remains show the healed fracture of a right forearm, of the sort caused by fending off a blow, along with damage consistent with a career of ball-playing. 16 rulers followed him across 4 centuries, and the dynasty never stopped talking about him. Late in the sequence, the 16th ruler commissioned Altar Q, a square block carved on all 4 sides, with 16 seated figures, each identified by name, running in order around the stone. The last 2 are the 16th king himself, and, facing him, the founder, handing over a scepter across 350 years. It is a genealogy rendered as a single conversation. Copan's most spectacular monument is the hieroglyphic stairway. 63 steps rise up the face of a temple, and every riser is carved with glyphs, more than 2,200 of them, forming the longest known text in the Maya script. Flanking the stair, 5 seated rulers in full costume. Unfortunately, the stairway collapsed at some point and was partially reassembled in the early 20th century in the wrong order, so that reading it is a puzzle that epigraphers are still working through. Its construction was itself an answer to disaster. In the year 738, Copan's 13th ruler, Waxaclajuan Ubakawil, known informally as 18 Rabbit, was captured by the king of Quirigua, a much smaller center downriver, which had been Copan's subordinate, and beheaded. Quirigua promptly declared its independence and began erecting the tallest stelae ever raised by the Maya, one of them over 10 meters high. The humiliation for Copan was profound, and the great stairway, expanded and completed in the decades afterwards, reads as a deliberate attempt to reassert a broken authority through the sheer weight of recorded history. Inside one of Copan's pyramids, archaeologists tunneling through the fill found something no one expected: an entire earlier temple, preserved intact because a later king had buried rather than demolished it. Rosalila, as it is now called, still carries its original stucco decoration, painted red and green and cream, with a vast bird deity spreading its wings across the facade. Before sealing it, the Maya covered it in white plaster with what appears to have been considerable ceremony, as though putting a living thing carefully to sleep. Northwest of Copan, along the Usumacinta River where it forms a great looping meander, stood Yaxchilan, and here the speciality was carved lintels, stone beams set above doorways, so that anyone passing beneath looked up at the scene. The lintels of Yaxchilan are among the finest relief carvings ever produced in the Americas. One shows the bloodletting of Lady Kabal Suk that we visited earlier. Another shows her kneeling before the vision serpent, her face lifted, the ancestor warrior emerging from its jaws. Another shows Bird Jaguar IV in ballgame gear. The carving is crisp, confident, and the figures have real weight, real physical presence in space. And a short distance away, at a small dependent center called Bonampak, a farming community led explorers to a modest building in 1946 that turned out to contain the best preserved Maya wall paintings in existence. 3 rooms, painted around the year 790, in colors that a slow seepage of mineral-rich water had sealed under a translucent skin of calcium carbonate. The first room shows a court ceremony, a royal family presenting an heir, lords in white cloaks and jaguar pelts, a procession of musicians with turtle shell drums, rattles, wooden trumpets, and dancers in enormous headdresses. The second shows a battle in the forest, a chaotic tangle of warriors and spears, and its aftermath, captives stripped and seated on the steps of a pyramid, blood running from their fingers where the nails have been torn out. One man sprawled at the king's feet, the king himself standing calm above them in jaguar skin boots. The third shows the celebration, and an act of royal bloodletting, and a line of nobles piercing their own tongues. Nothing else conveys so directly what the classic Maya court looked like. The murals also, quietly, ended the last remnants of the peaceful astronomer myth, because there they were, the violence, the ceremony, and the music, all in one building, painted by people who saw nothing contradictory in the combination. Far to the north, in the low hills of the Puyuk region of Yucatan, an entirely different architectural style flourished in these same centuries. Pukuk buildings are horizontal rather than vertical, long, low ranges of rooms with plain lower walls and elaborately decorated upper facades, made from thousands of precisely cut mosaic stones, lattice patterns, colonnettes, stepped frets, and long rows of masks with hooked noses, generally identified with the rain god, stacked one above another at the corners of buildings. At Uxmal, the largest of these cities, stands a pyramid unlike any other, oval in plan with rounded corners, its sides so steep the stair feels vertical. Local tradition holds that it was built in a single night by a dwarf hatched from an egg, which is why it is called the Pyramid of the Magician. Beside it lies the vast quadrangle that the Spanish named the Nunnery, 4 ranges of buildings enclosing a courtyard, each facade differently decorated, and the whole composition arranged so deliberately that walking into it feels like walking into a piece of music. Uxmal had no cenote. Every drop of water it used was rainfall, caught and stored in bottle-shaped underground cisterns called chultanob, sealed with plaster, their openings ringed to keep out debris. An entire city, in a place with no river, no lake and no well, living for centuries on nothing but what fell from the sky. It is difficult to think of a clearer illustration of Maya ingenuity. It is also difficult to think of a more precarious arrangement, should the sky ever stop giving. Behind every building we have walked through tonight stood people whose names we mostly do not know, and occasionally do. That last part is unusual in the ancient world. Maya artists signed their work. On carved monuments at Piedras Negras, Yaxchilan, Copan and elsewhere, small texts appear at the edge of the composition identifying the sculptor, sometimes several of them working together on a single stela, occasionally with an indication of who was senior. On painted pottery, a phrase running around the rim can name the painter and, in a number of cases, state that he was a lord, or the son of a lord, or attached to a particular royal court. The most celebrated of these belongs to a man from the kingdom of Naranjo, whose vases carry a signature identifying him as a member of the royal family, and whose work is recognizable across dozens of vessels found scattered over hundreds of kilometers. He was a prince, and he was a professional painter, and those two facts sat comfortably together in a way they would not have done in most of the contemporary Old World. Painting a Maya vase was a demanding piece of work. The vessel was thrown by hand, without a potter's wheel, built up in coils and smoothed, then dried and coated with slip. The design was applied in mineral pigments before firing, with a brush of animal hair or feather quill, in a line that could not be corrected. The best of it has the confidence of Japanese ink painting, a single unbroken contour describing a shoulder, a jaw, the fall of a cloak. And what those vases show is the whole world. Palace scenes with the king seated on a cushioned throne, courtiers gesturing, a woman offering a bundle of cloth, a scribe with a brush behind his ear, and a folded book at his knee. Musicians, dwarfs, mythological episodes with the hero twins and the underworld lords, rabbits acting as scribes, a supernatural monkey painting a vase within a painting of a vase. Some of the finest, painted in the delicate line of the Codex style, and found around the Mirador basin and the region of a small site called La Corona, look so much like book illustration that most specialists believe the same workshops were painting both, and that in these vessels we are looking at the closest thing we will ever have to the lost libraries. Stone carving was another discipline entirely, and the constraint that governed it was that there was no metal. Limestone was worked with chert and flint chisels, with hammerstones, with abrasives of sand and water, and with a great deal of time. The sculptor roughed out the block, laid in the main masses, then worked down through progressively finer tools to a surface that was polished and then painted, because Maya stone sculpture was never intended to be seen as bare stone. Traces of red, blue, yellow, and green survive in the crevices of monuments across the region. Jade was harder still. Jadeite is tougher than steel, and cannot be carved in the ordinary sense. It can only be worn away. Maya lapidaries drilled it with hollow bird bone, and reed rotated against a slurry of quartz sand, and cut it with cord and abrasive, hour after hour, day after day. A large jade plaque with a seated lord and a hieroglyphic text represents months of labor in a material that punishes a single moment of impatience. When we say jade was more valuable to the Maya than gold, part of what we are saying is that it was more expensive in human time. The scribes, meanwhile, occupied a place close to the throne. Their title, Kuhun, seems to mean something like he of the holy books, or keeper of the sacred bundle. They were responsible for the codices, the royal archives, the calculation of dates, the composition of the texts that went onto monuments, and probably the education of royal children. Excavations at Aguateca uncovered a scribe's residence abandoned in a hurry during an attack, its contents still where they fell, shell inkpots with pigment residue still in them, pestles, a mosaic mirror, obsidian blades, and the bones of a stingray. They had a patron. In Maya art, the gods of writing are frequently shown as monkeys, young supernatural scribes with brushes and open books. And this seems to connect to an episode in the Popol Vuh, in which the elder half-brothers of the hero twins, who were musicians and artists, are turned into monkeys through their own arrogance. A civilization's sense of humor shows in what it does with its own patron deities. The Maya made the gods of literature into monkeys, and then had those monkeys paint the vases on which the joke was recorded. Buildings, finally, were the product of the largest workforce of all. Quarrying was done close to the site wherever possible, often in the same pits that later became reservoirs, with blocks split by driving wooden wedges into cut channels and soaking them so they swelled. The core of a pyramid was rubble and earth retained by rough walls, faced with cut stone, then coated in lime plaster several centimeters thick, then painted. Roof beams of sapodilla wood were used where a span was needed, and sapodilla is so dense and so resistant to rot and insects that many of the original beams at Tikal were still in place, holding their vaults, in the 19th century when they were removed and shipped to Europe by early explorers. The labor was almost certainly organized as an obligation owed to the ruler, seasonal, drawn from farming communities in the months when the fields did not need them. Enormous, but not necessarily unwilling. Building the mountain of your own city, in a society that believed the mountain was the source of maize and the doorway to the ancestors, may have felt less like conscription than like the largest thing a person could take part in. We should be careful, though, not to make it sound gentle. The same texts that record the dedication of these buildings record the captives sacrificed at that dedication. Both things belong to the same civilization, and neither cancels the other. And it is a mark of taking a people seriously that one declines to simplify them in either direction. The 8th century was the high point. More cities, more people, more monuments, more carved dates than at any moment before or since. Population estimates for the central lowlands at their peak run into the millions, with some researchers arguing for figures considerably higher still. Then the carving stops. It does not stop everywhere at once, and that is one of the most important details in the whole story. The pattern moves across the landscape like a slow tide going out. In the Petex Batoon region, in the west, cities were fortifying themselves as early as the 760s. Dos Pilas inhabitants tore down their own palaces to build hasty defensive walls across the plaza, and then abandoned the site. Palenque's last dated monument falls around 799. Copan's last is 822, and it is unfinished. An altar left with its inscription incomplete, which is somehow more affecting than any ruin. Tikal's last is 869. The very last long count date carved anywhere in the southern lowlands appears at Toninar in the year 909. A century and a half from first cracks to final silence. Not an event, a process, roughly as long as the period separating us from the 1870s. And what happened at the end of it was, in demographic terms, genuinely severe. Across the central and southern lowlands, populations fell by something in the order of 90% over the following century. Cities that had held tens of thousands held hundreds. Some were abandoned entirely. The rural landscape emptied as well, and the forest came back over the terraced hillsides, and the raised fields and the reservoirs, and stayed there. Notice, though, what did not happen. The Maya people did not disappear. Maya language, religion, and daily life carried on. In the north, in Yucatan, cities were not declining at all in this period. Several were flourishing. The southern collapse was regional, not universal, and it is more accurately described as a transformation, a rupture, a great redistribution of where and how people lived. So why? Dozens of explanations have been offered over the past century, some of them now abandoned entirely. Earthquake, epidemic disease, which is unlikely given that the catastrophic epidemics of the Americas came with Europeans centuries later. Foreign invasion, which has some evidence at particular sites but cannot account for the whole pattern. Peasant revolt, once fashionable, now regarded as at best a symptom. The current picture is not a single cause but a convergence, and the strongest single strand within it is climate. Paleoclimate evidence has accumulated steadily and from independent sources. Sediment cores from Lake Chichancanab in Yucatan showed layers of gypsum, which precipitates out when a lake evaporates faster than it fills, and those layers cluster in the 9th and 10th centuries. Isotope analysis of the same cause was used to estimate the scale of the shortfall, with one influential study suggesting annual rainfall may have dropped by around half at the worst points, with humidity down substantially as well. Stalagmites have refined the picture further. A stalagmite grows by fractions of a millimeter a year, as mineral-rich water drips onto it, and the chemistry of each layer records the conditions of the year it formed, which means a cave formation can be read rather like a tree ring. Work published in 2025 on a stalagmite from northwest Yucatan identified a series of severe wet season droughts between the years 871 and 1021, including a run of 8 droughts lasting 3 years or more, and one that persisted for 13 consecutive years. Consider what a 13-year drought means to a society whose entire agricultural system depends on the rains arriving in May, and whose cities store water in tanks sized for 1 dry season and not for 4. But climate alone does not explain it, and the field has become notably more careful about saying so. A study of lake sediments at Itzan, in the southwestern lowlands, found evidence of population collapse at a site where the local climate record shows no corresponding drought at all. Larger modeling work published in 2025 has argued that climate, warfare, and the diminishing returns of very large cities interacted, and that the cities most vulnerable were those that had grown biggest and most dependent on complex infrastructure. Layer in the other pressures, and the picture becomes coherent. Deforestation had been proceeding for centuries, driven by farming, by construction, and above all by the enormous appetite of lime plaster production. Fewer trees mean less transpiration, which reduces local rainfall, which makes a drought worse. Fewer trees also mean soil washing off hillsides into the valleys and into the reservoirs. Soil exhaustion followed intensification, the gentle rotational milpa of the early villages, with long fallow periods, cannot feed a city of 60,000. The Maya responded brilliantly, with terraces and raised fields and shortened fallows, but intensive systems have thinner margins. Warfare escalated. The late 8th century texts describe more conflict, more destruction of cities rather than mere capture of lords, and the archaeology shows fortifications going up at sites that had never needed them. And through all of it ran the ideological problem, which may have been the sharpest of all. The Kuhula Jau's entire claim to authority rested on his ability to intercede with the gods and secure the rains. When the rains failed year after year, when the reservoirs went green and then dry, when children began to die, the king's failure was not administrative, it was theological. He had said he could do this, he could not. Recent work on royal tombs at several sites has found evidence of deliberate desecration during this period. Burials broken open, remains scattered, thrones smashed. In the 9th century, some people were not merely leaving, they were settling accounts. There is no reason to think a single family made a single decision. What almost certainly happened is what happens in every such unraveling. Individual households, one at a time, over years, concluded that the situation where they were had become worse than the risk of leaving, and went. Some moved north, some moved to the coasts, or to the lakes of the Peten where water was reliable. Some drifted into the highlands. Each departure made life slightly harder for those who stayed, and so the next departure came sooner. The plazas emptied gradually. Plaster cracked and weeds came through. The reservoirs silted. Roof beams of sapodilla wood, some of which had held for 4 centuries, finally gave way, and vaults came down. Seeds dropped by birds took root in the joints of the terraces, and roots widened them, and the forest did what forests do. And while all of this was happening in the south, the north was rising. Chichen Itza became, in the 9th and 10th centuries, the dominant power of the northern lowlands, and one of the largest cities in Mesoamerica. It is also unmistakably different from what came before. The Great Pyramid at its center, El Castillo, is a rigorous piece of calendrical architecture. 9 terraces, 4 stairways of 91 steps each, which with the top platform give 365 panels arranged so that each face carries 52 of them. Inside it, an earlier pyramid, and inside the temple of that earlier pyramid, a red-painted jaguar throne with jade spots and a turquoise mosaic disc. Around it spreads a city of a very different character to Tikal or Palenque. Colonnaded halls, hundreds of columns supporting flat roofs, providing large covered public spaces, of a kind the classic Maya never built. Wide platforms carved with rows of skulls. Reclining figures, holding shallow bowls on their stomachs, that appear in central Mexican contexts as well. Feathered serpent imagery everywhere. For a long time this was explained as a Toltec conquest, a takeover by warriors from Tula in central Mexico, with Chichen Itza as a colonial imposition. That model has largely collapsed under closer dating, which showed that Chichen Itza's supposedly derivative architecture is in several cases earlier than the Tula equivalents. The relationship now looks less like conquest and more like membership of a genuinely international Mesoamerican world, in which coastal trade, shared military ideology, and a widely traveled elite carried styles in several directions at once. Chichen Itza also seems to have been governed differently. Its inscriptions name multiple lords in what appears to be a shared or council-based arrangement, rather than a single divine king filling every monument with his own image. Whether that was a genuine constitutional innovation or simply a different way of presenting a dynasty is debated. Either way, the great age of the individual god-king was passing. Chichen Itza itself declined in the 13th century, and the last significant Maya capital of the north, Mayapan, rose in its place, a walled city of some 12,000 people, its buildings smaller and cruder copies of Chichen's, ruled by an alliance of noble families. It held together for 2 centuries and then fell apart in factional violence around the year 1448. By the time Europeans appeared on the horizon, the Yucatan was divided into some 16 or 17 independent provinces, mutually suspicious, sometimes at war. In the Guatemalan highlands, the Quiche and the Kaqchikel and their neighbors were similarly divided. That fragmentation would have consequences. The first contact came in 1502, off the coast of Honduras, with the trading canoe that Columbus intercepted and let go. In 1511, a Spanish ship foundered in the Caribbean, and a handful of survivors reached the Yucatan coast, where most were killed. 2 lived. One, Jerónimo de Aguilar, was eventually ransomed and became Cortez's interpreter. The other, Gonzalo Guerrero, learned Maya, married a noblewoman, had children, tattooed and pierced himself in the Maya fashion, and when the Spanish came for him, he refused to leave. He fought against them and died fighting, and in modern Mexico, there are statues of him as the father of a new people. The conquest of the Maya was nothing like the conquest of the Mexica. Tenochtitlan fell in 2 years. The Maya took nearly 2 centuries. The reasons were structural. There was no single capital whose fall would decide the matter, no emperor to capture. The Spanish had to take each province separately, and each time they thought they had finished, another rose behind them. The terrain was appalling for European campaigning. Forest, swamp, no roads, disease, and in the north almost no surface water, which meant an army could not move without local guides and local wells. In the highlands, Pedro de Alvarado, a man whose reputation for cruelty was notable even among the conquistadors, arrived in 1524 and exploited existing divisions with great skill, allying with the Kaqchikel against the Quiche and then turning on the Kaqchikel in due course. In the north, The campaign began in 1527 and failed. It was tried again in 1531 and failed again. It succeeded only in the 1540s, and even then incompletely, and rebellion followed for generations. What decided it, more than steel or horses or firearms, was disease. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and later typhus arrived in populations with no acquired immunity whatsoever, and moved ahead of the Spanish themselves. Estimates of mortality vary, but the scale is not in doubt. The great majority of the population of the Maya region died within a century of contact. Whole provinces were depopulated before a Spanish soldier ever reached them. It is the single largest catastrophe in the history of these peoples, and it happened largely invisibly, in villages, to families, without a battle being fought. Then, in 1562, at a place called Mani, came an act of destruction of a different kind. Diego de Landa was a Franciscan friar, and by the standards of his order not an unusually harsh man. He had learned Maya, he was interested in Maya customs, and recorded them in detail. But he discovered that converts under his care were continuing to make offerings to their own gods, and he responded with an inquisition of terrible severity, using torture on a scale that shocked even the colonial authorities, and led to his eventual recall to Spain to answer for it. At the culmination of that campaign, he gathered the books. In his own account, written afterwards, he described finding a great number of volumes containing nothing that was not superstition and falsehood of the devil, and burning them, and he noted that the Maya watching this felt it to an astonishing degree, and that it caused them great affliction. He is describing a people watching their libraries burn. He knows they are grieving. He records it as a curiosity. We do not know exactly how many books were destroyed at Manatí, and other burnings took place elsewhere. Between those fires, the tropical climate, and 4 centuries of neglect, 4 codices remain out of a literature that must have run to thousands of volumes. Astronomy, history, medicine, prophecy, genealogy, ritual, and who knows what else. Poetry, perhaps. Stories. Landa is not, however, purely a villain in this story, and history rarely permits such tidy accounting. Defending himself in Spain, he wrote an account of Yucatan as full and as detailed as he could make it, describing Maya houses, food, marriage customs, warfare, the calendar, the counting system, and, fatefully, that garbled alphabet given to him by his informant. 4 centuries later, that alphabet was the key that let Yuri Knorozov begin reading the script. The man who burned the books also, entirely by accident, preserved the means of reading the ones that survived. There is no moral to be drawn from that. It is simply true, and it is the kind of thing history does. Resistance continued long after the conquest was officially complete. In the deep forest of the Petén, on an island in Lake Petén Itzá, the Itza Maya maintained an independent kingdom at Nojpetén, with its own king, its own temples and its own idols, for 170 years after Cortés first passed through. Cortés himself stopped there in 1525, was received courteously, left behind a lame horse, and moved on. The Itza, uncertain what to do with the animal, reportedly fed it flowers and meat, and when it died, made a statue of it. Nojpetén finally fell to a Spanish assault on the 13th of March, 1697. It is the last independent indigenous kingdom in the Americas to be conquered, and by the time it fell, Newton had published the Principia, and the city of Boston was 67 years old. Even that was not the end. In 1847, the Maya of Yucatan rose in the caste war, took most of the peninsula, and came within reach of driving the Mexican state out entirely. An independent Maya polity, centered on the shrine of the Talking Cross, persisted in the eastern forests, unsubdued, into the 20th century. The story of Maya resistance runs, in other words, from 1511 to within living memory of people alive today. For 3 centuries after the conquest, the cities of the south lay under the forest, known to the people living near them and to almost no one else. That changed in the winter of 1839, when an American lawyer and travel writer named John Lloyd Stevens and an English architect and draftsman named Frederick Catherwood set out from New York for Central America. Stevens had a diplomatic appointment as an excuse. What he actually wanted was ruins. They traveled by mule through territory in the middle of a civil war, both of them repeatedly ill with malaria, and they reached Copan, which Stevens promptly purchased for $50 from a local landowner who could not imagine why anyone would want it. What Stevens wrote about that first morning has never been improved upon as a description of the experience. He described the site as a vessel found drifting at sea with no crew and no papers, giving no indication of where it had come from or who had sailed it. Nobody, he said, could tell them. Catherwood set up his camera lucida in the mud, with an assistant holding an umbrella over him against the rain, and drew. He drew for months, across dozens of monuments at Copan, Palenque, Uxmal, and elsewhere, and his drawings are astonishing, accurate to the individual glyph, recording detail that has since eroded away, and beautiful enough to be art in their own right. Their book, published in 1841, sold in enormous numbers and did something more important than popularize a subject. It made an argument. The prevailing assumption in Europe and North America was that these monuments must have been built by somebody else: Egyptians, Phoenicians, Israelites, Atlanteans, anyone at all except the ancestors of the indigenous people living beside them. Stevens rejected that flatly. He pointed to the local resemblance in the carved faces, the continuity of the surrounding population, the absence of any Old World feature in the architecture. These cities, he insisted, were built by Americans. He was entirely right, and it is worth naming clearly why the alternative was so attractive to his contemporaries and remains attractive to a certain kind of television program today. If a civilization can be attributed to lost white voyagers or visitors from elsewhere, then the people whose land was being taken need not be credited with anything. The ancient astronaut theories, the Atlantis theories, the lost tribes, strip away the packaging, and what remains is a refusal to accept that the ancestors of a colonized people built something magnificent without help. They did. Without metal, without wheels, without draft animals, in a rainforest, they built cities that ran for 1,000 years, invented writing and zero independently, and tracked Venus more accurately than anyone in Europe would manage for another millennium. Which brings us, at last, to the present, and to the part of this story that most people never hear. The Maya are here. More than 6 million people today identify as Maya. In Guatemala, they make up something close to half the national population. There are large populations in the Mexican states of Yucatan, Campeche, Quintana Roo, and Chiapas, in Belize, in western Honduras and El Salvador, and substantial communities in the United States, particularly in Los Angeles, Houston, and southern Florida. Around 30 distinct Mayan languages are spoken. Quiche has more than 1 million speakers. Quiche, Kaqchikel, Mam, and Yucatec Maya each have hundreds of thousands. These are not remnants. They are living languages with contemporary literature, radio stations, dictionaries, school programs, and, increasingly, a presence online. Traditions have persisted with remarkable tenacity, often by folding themselves inside the forms of the religion that arrived with the conquest. In highland Guatemala, daykeepers still count the 260-day tzolkin, consulting it for the naming of children and the timing of ceremonies, an unbroken sequence running back more than 2,000 years. In the church at Chichicastenango, worshippers burn copal on the steps before entering, exactly where an earlier temple stood. At Santiago Atitlan, offerings are made to a figure who is neither wholly a saint nor wholly an ancestor deity, and everyone involved understands perfectly well what is going on. Weaving carries meaning as well as beauty. The huipil, the woven blouse worn by Maya women across the highlands, uses patterns specific to individual towns, so that a person's origin can be read from her clothing at a glance. Many of the motifs are ancient, diamond shapes representing the four-cornered world with the sun crossing it, zigzags for lightning, figures of the plumed serpent. A woman weaving at a backstrap loom in Guatemala this morning was working with a design system that appears on painted vases from the 7th century. And the milpa endures. Maize, beans, and squash grown together in the same combination on hillsides that have fed families for 4,000 years, none of which should be sentimentalized. Modern Maya history includes some of the worst violence in the Western Hemisphere in the 20th century. During Guatemala's civil war, and particularly between 1981 and 1983, the army conducted a campaign in the highlands that a United Nations-backed Truth Commission later concluded had constituted acts of genocide against Maya communities. Hundreds of villages were destroyed. Estimates of the dead run to around 200,000, the overwhelming majority of them indigenous. Land dispossession, discrimination, and poverty continue. When Rigoberta Menchú, a Quiché woman who lost her family in that war, was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1992, it was 500 years, almost exactly, after Columbus. So when someone says the Maya disappeared, understand what that sentence quietly does. It closes the file. It makes the story safely ancient and therefore over. It is not true, and the people it is not true about have very good reason to object to it. The archaeology, meanwhile, has entered an extraordinary period, and it is happening right now. LIDAR has changed everything in barely a decade. The Great Petén Survey of 2018 mapped over 2,000 square kilometers of Guatemalan forest and revealed more than 60,000 previously unknown structures: houses, terraces, causeways, defensive works, and vast agricultural systems in areas presumed empty. Population estimates for the classic lowlands were revised sharply upwards, in some assessments to 7 million or more. Since then, the technique has kept delivering. The nearly 500 ceremonial complexes identified in Tabasco and the discovery of Aguada Phoenix rewrote the origins of Maya monumental building. The Campeche survey of 2024 found an entire unrecorded city beside a working highway, in a region archaeologists had written off. The lead researcher's remark on that occasion is worth keeping. It is an exclamation mark, he said, on the statement that we have not found everything. Ancient DNA is opening another door entirely. Genetic work on individuals from Chichen Itza has established close family relationships among sacrificial victims and traced continuity between ancient populations and the people living in nearby communities today, who in one recent study were shown to carry immune system signatures shaped by the colonial epidemics their ancestors survived. And the epigraphy continues. Every year a few more glyphs yield. Somewhere, right now, a graduate student is looking at a photograph of a weathered stela and suddenly understanding a phrase that nobody has read for 1100 years. The work is nowhere near finished. Whole cities remain unexcavated. Some, certainly, remain undiscovered. Now, let us slow down, because the night has moved on, and we are nearly at the end. Think about what this civilization actually managed. They looked at a wild grass, and, over 5,000 years of patient selection, carried out by people who never met and never knew they were part of one project, turned it into maize. They looked at a forest that Europeans would later dismiss as hostile to civilization and built cities in it, feeding hundreds of thousands of people with terraces and raised fields and orchards and managed woodland in an agricultural system that was, in its way, far more sophisticated than the monocultures that replaced it. They looked at a sky without telescopes and mapped it so precisely that their lunar and planetary figures still hold up against modern values. They looked at the problem of representing speech in marks and solved it from scratch, one of only a handful of times in the whole human record. They looked at nothing and gave it a symbol, and then, when the rains failed and the system that had carried them for centuries no longer worked, they did what human beings have always done. They adapted, they moved, they rebuilt somewhere else, differently. They survived a conquest, and then survived 4 centuries of colonialism, and then survived a genocide, and their grandchildren are teaching their languages in schools tonight. Perhaps that is the thing worth carrying away from all of this. Not the pyramids, magnificent as they are, not the calendar, precise as it is, but the continuity underneath. Civilizations are not permanent. Every one of them, without exception, has been temporary. What outlasts them is quieter, a way of planting, a pattern woven into cloth, the names of the days, the story of 2 brothers who went down into the dark and came back. Those things travel. They pass from a grandmother to a child in a kitchen, unremarkably, and they cross 1,000 years without anyone noticing. Somewhere in the Petan right now, it is the middle of the night. The forest is not silent. It never is. Insects are keeping up their steady electric hum. A nightjar calls. Somewhere far off, a howler monkey shifts in its sleep and rumbles. Above the canopy, the same stars the Maya watched are moving through the same positions, on the same schedule, being counted, still, by people who have never stopped counting. And below them, under 1,000 years of leaf litter and root, the plazas are still there, the stairways, the reservoirs, the stelae with their kings standing in full regalia, still declaring their victories to a forest that stopped listening a long time ago. Everything settles, in the end. That is not a sad thought. It is simply what happens. The stone settles, the forest settles, the night settles, and so can you. Let the shoulders go, let the hands unfold. There is nothing left in this story that needs your attention, and nothing at all that needs solving tonight. Let the green close over. Thank you for spending these hours with me, and for letting me be part of the quiet end of your day. It's a privilege I don't take lightly. If this journey gave you some rest, or some wonder, or simply somewhere gentle to put your mind for a while, then it did exactly what it was meant to do. If you'd like more of these, subscribing helps more than you'd think, and it means the next one finds you. And if there's a story you'd like us to travel into together, leave it in the comments. That's genuinely where most of these begin. Until the next journey, sleep into power, guys. Good night.